Rule 5 states that no manuscript in the Apostolic Archive may remain unobserved for longer than 7 minutes. My name is Maria Key, and I have served as Senior Manuscript Archivist in the Vatican Secret Archives for 11 years. The work requires absolute precision, unwavering devotion, and most importantly, strict adherence to protocols established centuries before my birth. These rules were not suggestions, they were sacred law, written in the blood of those who learned their necessity the hard way. The Apostolic Archive sits 3 levels beneath the main Vatican library, accessible only through a narrow stone corridor that descends past frescoed walls depicting scenes of divine judgment. The air grows thicker with each step downward, heavy with the weight of centuries and the whispered prayers of countless scholars who walked this path before me. My office was a modest chamber carved from Vatican stone, illuminated by fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows across rows of climate-controlled manuscript cases. Each morning at precisely 7 o'clock, I would descend those steps carrying my leather satchel containing white cotton gloves, a magnifying lens, and the brass key that opened Cabinet's 17th repository for manuscripts requiring special supervision. These documents, dating from the 9th to 14th centuries, were marked with red wax seals and stored in individual copper-lined boxes. The official designation was texts requiring continuous observation, though we archivists simply called them the watched documents. Rule 5 applied exclusively to these manuscripts. During examination, an archivist must maintain visual contact at all times. Bathroom breaks required a colleague to stand watch. Lunch was eaten at the examination table. Phone calls were forbidden. Even blinking was to be kept brief and deliberate. The Vatican had employed teams of 2 archivists for this purpose, until budget cuts in 2007 reduced us to solo shifts. I never questioned these protocols. The Church had preserved knowledge for 2 millennia through such meticulous care. The first anomaly occurred on a Tuesday in late October. I was examining manuscript 47, a 13th century treatise on theological paradoxes written by an unnamed monk. The text was penned in elegant Latin script, each letter formed with devotional precision. I had studied this particular document dozens of times, could recite entire passages from memory. But that morning something felt different. I excused myself, briefly perhaps, 30 seconds so, retrieved my secondary magnifying glass from the shelf behind me. When I returned my attention to the manuscript, I noticed a peculiarity in the margin notes. There appeared to be an additional line of text in the lower right corner, written in the same medieval hand as the original but somehow fresher. The ink seemed to glisten slightly under the fluorescent lights. I photographed the page immediately and compared it to my digital archives. The new text was not present in any previous documentation. The Latin phrase read, "She who watches shall be watched in return." My hands trembled as I recorded the discovery in my daily log, noting the time as 9:43 in the morning. I convinced myself that I had simply overlooked this marginal note in previous examinations. The mind plays tricks after years of staring at ancient text, but the ink that glistening quality remained troubling. Over the following weeks, similar additions appeared in other watch documents, always in the original scribal hand, always in Latin, always when I had momentarily looked away, despite my careful adherence to Rule 5. The messages grew increasingly personal. Maria Key seeks knowledge beyond her station. The watcher becomes the watched. She counts the minutes but forgets the hours. I reported these anomalies to Cardinal Torretti, the chief archivist, but he dismissed my concerns as stress-induced hallucinations. 11 years is a long time to spend in those chambers, he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Perhaps you need a brief reassignment to the upper collections. But I knew what I was seeing was real. The manuscripts were changing. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in November. I was working late, alone in the archive as autumn darkness settled over Vatican City. Manuscript 19 lay open before me, a collection of visions recorded by a 12th century mystic. The original text described prophetic dreams of papal succession and ecclesiastical reform. At precisely 9:17 in the evening, my phone buzzed with an emergency text from my sister in Seoul. Our mother had collapsed and was being rushed to the hospital. For exactly 8 minutes and 33 seconds, I stared at that message, paralyzed by the distance between Rome and home, completely forgetting my sacred duty. When I finally looked back at the manuscript, my heart stopped. The ancient parchment now contained 3 full pages of new text, written in my own handwriting but in flawless medieval Latina language I barely spoke conversationally. The script was unmistakably mine. The distinctive way I formed my letter A, the slight leftward slant I'd developed in graduate school, even the small flourish I added to concluding punctuation. But I had never written these words. The text described events I had never experienced, conversations I had never had, decisions I had never made. It detailed my resignation from the Vatican archive, my return to Seoul, my mother's recovery, and my marriage to a man named David Kim, someone I had never met. The prophecy continued through years of my imagined life. The birth of 2 children, a career teaching medieval history at Yonsei University, and my eventual death at age 79 in a small apartment overlooking the Han River. My own handwriting had documented an entire future life, complete with dates, locations, and intimate details that felt impossibly real. The manuscript described my future daughter's first words, the exact phrasing of my eventual resignation letter, and the specific prayers I would whisper on my deathbed decades from now. But most disturbing was the final paragraph, written in my familiar script, but somehow different, more confident, more resigned. I broke Rule 5 on November 14, 2013, at 9:17 in the evening. The manuscripts do not predict the future. They create it. Every unwatched moment writes our destiny in ink that cannot be erased. Maria Key will choose her path, but the choice was written centuries before her birth. I sat in that stone chamber until dawn, staring at my own prophetic handwriting while my mother recovered 7,000 miles away, exactly as the manuscript had foretold. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal hymn above me, and I understood with crystalline clarity that I was no longer simply an archivist. I was a character in someone else's story, written by my own hand in a language I barely understood. 3 days later, I submitted my resignation to Cardinal Toretti. He accepted it without surprise, as if he had been expecting my decision for weeks. "The manuscripts require a particular kind of person," he said, not looking up from his desk. "Not everyone is suited for such work." As I cleaned out my office, I found a new addition to the Vatican Archive protocols, freshly printed and awaiting distribution to staff. Rule 6. No archivist shall serve in the watched documents collection for more than 10 years. I left Rome on a morning flight to Seoul, carrying only my satchel and the certain knowledge that every step I took was leading me toward a future already written in my own hand. My mother was waiting at Incheon Airport, fully recovered, smiling the exact smile the manuscript had described. Behind me, in a stone chamber beneath the Vatican, Manuscript 19 lay open on an examination table, waiting for the next archivist to break Rule 5 and discover what their own handwriting had planned for them centuries ago. They told me the vault would never grow heavier, only lighter, as documents were transferred to the archives above. My name is Marco Alberti, and I have served as night custodian of the Apostolic Archives Correspondence Vault for 7 years. The vault sits 3 levels beneath the Vatican Library, behind a door marked only with the papal seal and accessible through a narrow corridor that smells perpetually of parchment and sanctified wax. My duties are simple: monitor the vault's environmental controls, ensure the copper seals remain intact on the correspondence chambers, and record the weight readings at prescribed intervals throughout my shift. The vault houses 5 centuries of papal correspondence, organized in climate-controlled chambers according to pontificate and sealed with blessed copper bands that must never be disturbed. Each chamber maintains precise temperature and humidity while protecting letters that shape the course of Christendom. Letters from kings pleading for annulments, confessions from saints detailing their visions, desperate pleas from bishops facing persecution, all preserved in sacred silence. Every night at 9 o'clock, I descend the marble steps, pass through 3 security checkpoints, and begin my vigil. The vault door requires 2 keys turned simultaneously and Father Toretti's, who escorts me down and returns at dawn. The weight monitoring system was installed in 1997 after structural concerns about the vault's foundation. The total weight rarely fluctuates more than a few grams, as parchment naturally expands and contracts with atmospheric changes. I perform readings every 4 hours, 9 p.m., 1 a.m., and 5 a.m. The routine has become meditation. I walk the perimeter, checking each chamber's seal, recording temperatures, noting any irregularities in my logbook. The silence down there is absolutino. City noise penetrates those depths. Only the whisper of climate control systems and my own measured breathing. 3 months ago, I noticed something peculiar during my 1 a.m. reading. The vault's total weight had increased by exactly 47 grams since 9 p.m. Not unusual in itself, moisture can affect parchment, but the environmental controls showed no fluctuation in humidity. I noted the anomaly and continued my rounds. By 5 a.m., the weight had returned to normal. The following night, the same thing occurred. 47 grams heavier at 1 a.m., normal by dawn. I mentioned it to Father Toretti, who assured me that such fluctuations were within acceptable parameters. But the pattern continued night after night. Always the same increase, always at 1 a.m., always resolved by morning. 2 weeks later, the weight began increasing at precisely 3:17 a.m. instead. Still 47 grams, still gone by dawn, but the timing had shifted for no apparent reason. I started arriving at the vault earlier, performing additional readings to pinpoint when the change occurred. The weight would be normal at 3:15, increased at 3:17, lasting until approximately 4:43 a.m. I began to dread that moment. 3:17 a.m. became a boundary in my mind, separating the peaceful early hours from something I couldn't name. The vault felt different during that period, not physically but spiritually. The silence seemed deeper, the shadows between the climate control units appeared to shift subtly, and I found myself holding my breath while recording the measurements. Last month, the weight increase jumped to 94 grams, exactly double the previous amount. Father Toretti ordered a full inspection of the vault systems. Engineers found nothing wrong. The seals remained intact, the chambers undisturbed, the environmental controls functioning perfectly. Yet each night at 3:17, the vault grew heavier by those precise 94 grams. I started staying closer to the monitoring station during that hour, watching the digital display climb at exactly 3:17. The numbers would shift gradually: 91 grams, 92, 93, then 94, as if something was being slowly added to the vault's contents. But nothing visible changed. The chambers remained sealed, the corridors empty, the silence unbroken. 3 nights ago, everything changed. At 3:17 a.m., the weight increased not by 94 grams, but by 141. The climate control system detected a minor temperature spike in Chamber 70, section housing correspondence from the pontificate of Pope Innocent VIII. I approached the chamber's viewing window, a thick pane of blessed glass that allows visual inspection without breaking the seal. Inside, scattered across the chamber floor, lay dozens of letters that hadn't been there during my previous inspection. The parchment appeared fresh, cream-colored, rather than the yellowed brown of centuries-old documents. Each letter was sealed with red wax, bearing no recognizable insignia. My hands trembled as I activated the chamber's internal lighting system. The letters were addressed in a handwriting I recognized immediately, my mother's careful script, unchanged since childhood when she would pen notes for my school lunchbox. But my mother, God rest her soul, had been dead for 12 years. The addresses were impossible. Marco Alberti, Night Custodian, Apostolic Archive, Vatican City. Letters written centuries before I was born, addressed to a position that hadn't existed until modern times, in handwriting belonging to a woman who had lived and died in a small village outside Naples. I called Father Toretti immediately, breaking protocol. He arrived within the hour, accompanied by 2 archivists I'd never seen before. They examined the chamber through the viewing window while I stood aside, feeling somehow responsible for this violation of sacred order. The archivists spoke in hushed Latin, their conversation too rapid for me to follow completely. I caught fragments. Maternal script, temporal displacement, requires immediate containment. Father Toretti approached me with an expression I couldn't interpret, not anger, not fear, but something approaching pity. Marco, he said gently, these letters appear to be addressed to you personally. Church doctrine requires that you read them before we can proceed with proper containment protocols. They opened Chamber 7 using emergency protocols I'd never witnessed. The copper seal was cut with blessed shears, prayers were recited in 3 languages, and holy water was sprinkled around the chamber's threshold. The letters lay in neat piles, organized by some invisible logic. I lifted the first letter with gloved hands. The wax seal bore the impression of my mother's wedding ring, a simple band I had placed on her finger in her coffin. The parchment felt warm despite the chamber's controlled temperature. The letter was dated 1573, written in Italian mixed with phrases in our family's regional dialect. My mother's voice seemed to speak from the page. My dearest son, I write to you from a place of shadows, where the weight of unspoken words grows heavier with each passing century. I know you serve faithfully in God's house, but there are confessions that transcend death, sins that follow bloodlines through generations of silence. Each letter contained fragments of family history I'd never known, secrets about my grandfather's wartime actions, my grandmother's hidden faith, choices made by ancestors whose names I'd never heard. But threading through every letter was my mother's desperate plea for absolution, not for her own sins, but for the accumulated guilt of our family line. The final letter, dated just yesterday, contained only 1 line. The weight you measure each night is the burden of our unconfessed sins, my son. Only you can lift it from our family's soul. The chamber stands empty now. The letters vanished at dawn, as completely as they had appeared. The vault's weight readings have returned to normal, fluctuating only within expected parameters. Father Toretti has assigned me to different duties: daytime archive maintenance, far from the correspondence vault. But each morning at 3:17, I wake in my quarters above ground, feeling the weight of those unread confessions settling into my bones. The church keeps its own counsel about what transpired that night. New protocols have been established for the correspondence vault, operated by guards who've never heard my name. Sometimes I wonder if my mother's letters are still down there, waiting in chambers I'll never see again, growing heavier with each passing night until someone else inherits the burden of reading what the dead have written for the living. They told me never to work on the martyrs alone after sunset. My name is Elena Toretti, and I have served as senior art restorer in the Vatican museums for 11 years. The sacred works entrusted to my care span centuries of devotion, each brushstroke a prayer made manifest in pigment and gold. I take this responsibility with the reverence it deserves, following protocols established long before my birth, procedures that have kept these holy artifacts intact through wars, floods, and the endless passage of time. The restoration laboratory sits in the basement of the Pinacoteca, accessible only through a series of coded doors and blessed thresholds. The air here carries the scent of linseed oil and ancient wood, mixed with something indefinable perhaps, the accumulated breath of countless pilgrims who have gazed upon these works in wonder. My workspace overlooks a small courtyard where Swiss guards pace their eternal rounds, their footsteps marking time like a sacred metronome. The painting arrived without ceremony on a Tuesday morning in November of 2023. Madonna and St. Lucia, attributed to Giovanni di Paolo, circa 1360. The work had been stored in the Vatican's climate-controlled archives for decades, deemed too fragile for public display. Cardinal Benedetti himself delivered the restoration order, sealed with red wax and bearing instructions I had never seen before. Restoration to be completed in solitude. Evening work discouraged. Report any anomalies immediately. The saint's face drew my attention first, as it always does with medieval martyrs. St. Lucia gazed outward with eyes that seemed too knowing, too present for mere paint and varnish. Her traditional symbols were there: the palm branch of martyrdom, the small lamp representing her role as bringer of light. But something in her expression suggested she was looking not at the viewer, but through them, searching for something just beyond the visible world. I began each day at 7 in the morning, carefully cleaning centuries of accumulated grime from the painting's surface. The work progressed normally for the first week. Lucia's robes emerged in brilliant crimson and gold, her hands delicate and pale against the dark background. I followed standard protocols, photographing each stage, documenting every decision, working with the patient precision my training demanded. It was during the second week that I first noticed her eyes following my movements. The sensation began as nothing more than peripheral awareness, the feeling one gets when being observed. I would position myself to work on the lower portion of the painting and catch myself glancing upward to meet what felt like a waiting gaze. The rational part of my mind dismissed this as normal. Restoration work requires such intimate focus that paintings often begin to feel alive, their subjects becoming familiar as old friends. But St. Lucia's eyes were different. They held an urgency I had never encountered in medieval art. While cleaning the area around her left temple, I found myself turning to look directly at her face. Her painted eyes seemed to shift slightly, as if adjusting to maintain contact with mine. The movement was so subtle I questioned whether I had seen it at all, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I began staying later to make up for time lost to these strange distractions. The laboratory grew quiet after 6 in the evening, when the last of the conservation staff departed for home. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric prayers overhead, and the Swiss guards' footsteps echoed from the courtyard with mathematical precision. In this solitude, I could work without interruption, focusing entirely on the delicate process of revealing Lucia's true colors beneath centuries of darkened varnish. It was during one of these evening sessions that I first heard her whisper. I had been working on the area around her mouth, using a cotton swab dipped in solvent to remove a particularly stubborn layer of old restoration attempts. The work required me to lean close to the canvas, my face mere inches from hers. As I concentrated on a small section of her lower lip, I heard what sounded like breathing, slow, deliberate inhalations that seemed to come from the painting itself. I stepped back, my heart beating faster than the work warranted. The laboratory was empty, the ventilation system providing the only ambient sound. I returned to my work, but the sensation persisted. Each time I leaned close to the painting, I could swear I heard the soft rhythm of someone else's breath, matching my own. The following evening, I brought a small mirror to check my work from different angles. As I held it up to examine a section of Lucia's halo, I glimpsed something that made my hands tremble. In the mirror's reflection, St. Lucia's eyes were not looking at me, they were looking at the mirror itself, as if she could see her own reflection and was trying to communicate through it. I set the mirror aside and tried to focus on my work, but the feeling of being observed had grown overwhelming. Every reflective surface in the laboratory glass, covering other artworks, the chrome fixtures, even the glossy surface of my conservation tools, seemed to hold Lucia's gaze. No matter where I moved in the room, her eyes found me. By the third week, I had stopped looking directly at the painting except when absolutely necessary, but avoidance proved impossible. Lucia's presence filled the laboratory like incense, persistent and inescapable. I found myself working faster, desperate to complete the restoration and return the painting to storage. The protocols that usually brought me peace now felt like prison rules, keeping me trapped with something that should not be aware of my existence. The change in her expression became undeniable. Where medieval artists typically painted saints with serene acceptance of their martyrdom, Lucia's face now showed something closer to desperation. Her eyes had grown wider, more urgent, as if she were trying to warn me of some approaching danger. The paint itself seemed fresher each morning, as if the image were regenerating overnight. I began finding small changes in my other work as well. Paintings I had completed months ago showed signs of recent alteration. A figure's hand moved slightly. A background shadow shifted position. Always, these changes occurred in areas that would be visible to someone standing at my usual workstation. It was as if every sacred image in the laboratory had become aware of my presence. Turning to watch my work on St. Lucia, the mirror incidents escalated. I could no longer use any reflective surface without seeing Lucia's eyes staring back at me. The bathroom mirrors in the museum showed her face superimposed over my own reflection. The black screen of my computer displayed her worried expression, even when powered off. Walking through the Vatican's marble corridors became an exercise in avoiding the polished surfaces that lined every hallway. Other staff members began commenting on my appearance. Father Martinez mentioned that I looked pale, suggested I might benefit from more rest. Sister Catherine, who managed the museum's archives, asked if I was feeling well, noting that I seemed distracted during our weekly conservation meetings. I wanted to explain what was happening, but the words felt impossible to speak. How could I tell them that a 14th century saint was watching me through every reflective surface in the Vatican? The final night began like all the others. I arrived at the laboratory just after sunset, planning to complete the last details of Lucia's restoration. The work was nearly finished, only a small section of background required attention. I'd convinced myself that completing the painting would end whatever strange connection had formed between us. As I prepared my tools, I became aware that something fundamental had changed. The laboratory felt different, charged with an energy I had never experienced. The air itself seemed thicker, as if filled with unspoken prayers. I approached the painting and found myself looking directly into St. Lucia's eyes for the first time in days. They were completely human now. Not painted eyes, but living ones, filled with tears that seemed ready to spill down her painted cheeks. Her lips, which I had so carefully restored to their original red, moved silently, forming words in what appeared to be Latin. I leaned closer, trying to understand what she was attempting to communicate. "Cave," she whispered, her voice as real as my own heartbeat. "Cave illa que venit. Beware. Beware of that which comes." I stepped backward, my restoration tools clattering to the floor. Every reflective surface in the laboratory now showed not my own reflection, but dozens of Saint Lucia, all with the same desperate expression, all mouthing the same warning. The mirrors multiplied her image infinitely, creating a corridor of concerned faces stretching into impossible distances. Behind me, I heard footsteps in the corridor, measured, deliberate, nothing like the Swiss Guard's familiar patrol. These steps carried weight beyond the physical, each footfall echoing with centuries of accumulated authority. St. Lucia's eyes widened further, and her whispered warnings became more urgent. I turned to see a figure in the doorway, backlit by the corridor's dim lighting. The silhouette wore cardinal's robes, but something about its proportions seemed wrong, as if the fabric draped over a form not quite human. It spoke in a voice that carried the weight of institutional power, requesting entry to observe my work. St. Lucia's warnings filled every reflection around me now, her voice joining with itself in a chorus of concern. I understood then that she had not been watching me with malevolent intent, but with protective desperation. She had been trying to warn me, trying to prepare me for this moment when something else would come, seeking what I had discovered through my careful restoration. The figure stepped into the laboratory, and every reflection of St. Lucia simultaneously turned to look at it, their painted faces showing recognition and fear. Whatever approach had been known to her in life had perhaps been the reason for her martyrdom, and now sought her again through the bridge my restoration work had somehow created. The following morning, I found myself reassigned to manuscript preservation in a different wing of the Vatican. The painting of St. Lucia was returned to storage without explanation, its restoration officially listed as complete, though I had touched not a single brushstroke of that final session. Cardinal Benedetti mentioned only that my work had been satisfactory, and that I should consider taking a brief sabbatical to rest. I never learned what happened in the laboratory after I left that night. The room was sealed for routine maintenance that lasted 6 months. When it reopened, new protocols were in place. All restoration work on martyrs must now be completed during daylight hours, with at least 2 conservators present. Mirrors are no longer permitted in the restoration areas. I still see St. Lucia sometimes, reflected in the windows of buses or the surface of my morning coffee. Her expression has grown peaceful again, but her eyes still hold recognition when they meet mine. I believe she knows I understood her warning, that I listened when she tried to protect me from whatever had come seeking her that final night. They never asked me what I learned during those 3 weeks of intimate work with her sacred image. Perhaps they already knew. Perhaps some knowledge is meant to remain in the painted prayers of the saints, whispered warnings preserved in pigment and gold, waiting for those with eyes to see and ears to hear the voices that speak from beyond the visible world. There are 17 rules governing the archive of sacred confessions, and I have broken none of them in my 23 years of service. My name is Father Marco Benedetti, and I serve as custodian of the Vatican's most sensitive repository, a subterranean chamber, 3 levels beneath the Apostolic Palace, where the Church's most grave confessions are preserved. Not all sins spoken in the confessional booth fade into absolution. Some require permanent documentation, sealed away from mortal ears until the final judgment. Murders, blasphemies, sins against the Holy Spirit itself, each confession captured on copper cylinders, catalogued by date and sealed with blessed wax bearing the papal insignia. The archive exists in perpetual candlelight. Electric illumination interferes with the sanctity of the recordings, or so Cardinal Toretti explained during my ordination to this position in 2001. The chamber spans the length of a cathedral nave, lined floor to ceiling with mahogany shelves bearing thousands of copper cylinders. Each bears a white label, date, confessor's initials, and a Roman numeral indicating the gravity of the sin. Category 7 cylinders, the most severe, stored behind a secondary vault sealed with 3 separate keys. My daily ritual begins at 6 in the morning with the Litany of St. Jerome, patron of sacred translators. I inspect each shelf systematically, ensuring no cylinders have been disturbed during the night. The copper develops a greenish patina when exposed to impure thoughts, requiring immediate reblessing. I maintain temperature logs, humidity readings, and detailed inventories of every confession received from parishes worldwide. The work demands absolute precision. The Church's darkest secrets rest in my care. For 23 years, this routine provided comfort. Sacred duty performed in holy solitude, witnessing humanity's capacity for evil while maintaining faith in divine forgiveness. The archive never changed. Until the morning of November 15th, 2024, I discovered the anomaly during my routine inspection of Section and Confessions from the Milan Archdiocese. A copper cylinder sat prominently on the Category 7 shelf, bearing no label, no date, no identifying marks whatsoever. The metal gleamed as if freshly forged, untouched by time or patina. According to protocol, unlabeled cylinders require immediate removal and examination by the Cardinal Secretary of State, but something about its pristine surface filled me with inexplicable dread. I lifted the cylinder with trembling hands. It felt unnaturally warm, almost alive. The blessing chamber adjacent to the archive contains equipment for playing confessional recordings, a necessity for translation and cataloging purposes. I inserted the cylinder into the blessed phonograph, crossed myself, and pressed the activation lever. My own voice emerged from the speakers. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 7 days since my last confession." The words carried my exact intonation, my slight Tuscan accent, even the particular way I paused before admitting guilt. But I had given no such confession. The voice continued, "I have taken 3 lives this week. Isabella Marchetti on Monday evening. I strangled her with piano wire in her apartment on Via dei Cappuccini. Antonio Rossi on Wednesday morning. I pushed him from the Ponte Sant'Angelo during his morning walk. Maria Volpe yesterday afternoon. I poisoned her coffee at Café Romano near the Spanish Steps." The confession detailed each murder with horrifying precision methods, locations, times, the victim's final words. My voice described intimate details only the killer could know. Isabella's blue ceramic rosary clutched in her death grip, Antonio's final prayer as he fell, Maria's confusion as the poison took hold. 27 minutes of meticulous testimony delivered in my voice, describing crimes I had never committed, victims I had never met. The recording ended with my voice speaking the act of contrition, followed by an unknown priest's absolution. Then silence. I replayed the cylinder 17 times that morning, each repetition confirming the impossible truth. My voice, my speech patterns, my breathing rhythms. Yet I remembered none of it. I had spent the previous week in the archive, following my standard routine, speaking to no one except during evening prayer. The murders described were pure fiction. Or so I believed until I read Thursday's edition of L'Osservatore Romano. The headline froze my blood. 3 mysterious deaths rock Rome. Isabella Marchetti, found strangled in her Via dei Cappuccini apartment Monday evening. Antonio Rossi, discovered drowned beneath Ponte Sant'Angelo Wednesday morning after witnesses saw him fall. Maria Volpe died of apparent poisoning at Café Romano Thursday afternoon. Each death occurred exactly as my voice had described, down to the smallest detail. The police attributed the deaths to unrelated coincidences. No connections existed between the victims. No evidence suggested foul play beyond the obvious methods of death. The investigation stalled within days. But I knew better. Somehow, impossibly, my confession had predicted or perhaps caused 3 innocent deaths. I examined the unlabeled cylinder obsessively, searching for any clue to its origin. The copper bore no manufacturer's marks, no serial numbers, no indication of age or provenance. It appeared on our shelves without documentation, without authorization, without explanation. According to archive protocol, I should have reported the anomaly immediately. Instead, I hid the cylinder in my private quarters and told no one. Night after night, I replayed the confession, memorizing every detail, hoping to understand how my voice could describe murders I never committed. The recording never changed. Yet each listening revealed new horrors. Background sounds I hadn't noticed before. Church bells tolling, footsteps on stone floors, whispered prayers in Latin. The confession had been recorded inside the Vatican itself, in one of our own confessional booths. But which booth? And when? And by whom? I began investigating secretly, checking every confessional in St. Peter's Basilica, comparing the acoustic signature of my recorded voice against each booth's unique sound characteristics. The confession had been recorded in Confessional 7th, same booth, where I had received my own weekly confession for the past 23 years. Father Giuseppe Torriani, my regular confessor, had died of heart failure 6 months earlier. No replacement had been assigned. Confessional 7 remained sealed, unused, empty. Yet somehow, my voice had emerged from that booth, confessing to murders that subsequently occurred exactly as described. On December 1st, I discovered a second unlabeled cylinder. This recording contained 14 minutes of my voice confessing to the murder of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, scheduled for December 7th during Vespers. The method, ricin poisoning administered through Blessed Communion wine. The location, his private chapel in the Apostolic Palace. Even his final words were predicted. The archive remembers everything. Cardinal Farnese died exactly as foretold. I found the third cylinder on December 10th. My voice confessed to killing Sister Catherine Benedetta, a librarian in the Vatican secret archives. Date, December 15th. Method, strangulation with a rosary cord. Location, reading room 7 during evening inventory. Her final prayer, the Memorare to the Blessed Virgin. By December 14th, I could no longer function. I spent hours kneeling before the Blessed Sacrament, begging for divine guidance, for understanding, for the strength to prevent Sister Catherine's prophesied death. But how could I warn her without revealing the archive's existence? How could I explain that my voice had confessed to a murder I would never commit? I didn't sleep on December 14th. At 3:17 in the morning, I felt compelled to visit Reading Room 7 in the secret archives. The corridors were empty, illuminated only by votive candles burning before sacred images. I entered the reading room and found Sister Catherine at her desk, cataloging manuscripts by lamplight. "Sister?" I called softly. She turned toward me, her face pale in the flickering light. "Father Benedetti, what brings you here at this hour?" I opened my mouth to warn her, to tell her to leave immediately, to break whatever supernatural chain connected my voice to these deaths. But different words emerged, words I had never intended to speak. "Bless me, sister, for I have sinned." My hands moved independently, reaching for her rosary cord. Her eyes widened in recognition not of me, but of something speaking through me. As my fingers closed around the beads, she whispered the Memorare exactly as my confession had predicted. The next morning, I returned to the archive of sacred confessions. A new unlabeled cylinder sat waiting on my desk, its copper surface gleaming like fresh blood. I have not found the courage to play it. Instead, I write this testimony, hoping someone will understand what the archive has become, what it has always been. There are 17 rules governing the archive of sacred confessions. The 18th rule, unwritten but absolute, is this: some confessions create the very sins they claim to absolve. The archive doesn't merely preserve our darkness, it cultivates it, nurtures it, ensures its eternal continuation. I am Father Marco Benedetti, and I have served faithfully for 23 years. But the archive has served longer, and its hunger grows with each confession sealed away in copper and blessed wax. The unlabeled cylinder remains unopened on my desk. I suspect it contains my final confession, the one I am about to give, the one that will complete whatever ancient pattern governs this place. Someone will find my testimony, read these words, and wonder how a faithful priest could descend into such madness. They will never understand that I am not the confessor. I am the confession. The dead keep perfect time. My name is Giuseppe Calvani, and for 32 years I have served as keeper of the Vatican's timepieces. Every clock, every chronometer, every ancient sundial within these sacred walls falls under my care. It is a duty I inherited from my father, as he inherited from his father before him. The Calvani family has wound the Vatican's clocks for over a century, and we have always understood one immutable truth. Time within these walls does not behave as it does in the world beyond. The workshop sits 3 levels beneath the Apostolic Palace, accessible only through a narrow stone staircase that descends behind the sacristy of St. Peter's Basilica. Here, surrounded by centuries of clockwork, I perform my daily rituals. Gregorian chimes from 1543 hang beside Baroque pendulum clocks crafted by master horologists of the 17th century. Each timepiece tells its own story through the rhythm of its mechanism, the particular timbre of its chime, the way shadows fall across its face. My father taught me to listen to them speak. "Giuseppe," he would say, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles as he wound the mainspring of a papal chronometer, "these clocks do not merely measure time, they guard it." I thought this was merely the poetic rambling of an old man devoted to his craft. I understand now that he was being quite literal. The anomaly began 3 months ago, though I suspect it had been building for years before I noticed. Every night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., every timepiece in my care would stop. Not slow, not skip-stop completely, as if time itself had been suspended within the Vatican walls. The silence during these moments was absolute, more profound than the quiet of empty cathedrals or sealed tombs. Even the electrical hum of modern clocks would cease, leaving only the sound of my own heartbeat echoing in the workshop. At first I assumed it was electromagnetic interference or some quirk of the Vatican's ancient electrical systems. I ran diagnostics, checked power sources, consulted with engineers from Rome. Everything appeared normal. The clocks would resume at 4:17 a.m. with perfect synchronization, as if nothing had occurred. Their timekeeping remained flawless throughout the day. Only during that single hour did they fall silent. The 3rd week, I decided to remain in the workshop during the phenomenon. I positioned myself at my workbench with a battery-powered digital watch device I normally despise, but which would serve as my reference point. At 3:16 and 59 seconds, I watched every pendulum freeze mid-swing. The second hand of my digital watch continued its circuit, but I could feel something fundamental shift in the air around me, as if the very molecules had been instructed to pause. That was when I heard the footsteps. The sound came from the corridor outside my workshop, measured, deliberate steps that echoed against stone walls. I knew every person authorized to access these lower levels, and no one should have been down here at this hour. The steps paused outside my door, followed by the distinctive sound of keys jangling against metal. My blood turned cold as I recognized the particular rhythm of those keys, the way they clinked together in a pattern I had heard countless times during my apprenticeship. My father had been dead for 7 years. The door opened without the creak I had grown accustomed to, moving silently on hinges that normally protested with every use. A figure entered, tall, slightly stooped, wearing the same gray maintenance coveralls that had been standard issue decades ago. His wire-rimmed spectacles caught the lamplight as he moved to the far wall where the oldest timepieces hung. "Papa?" The word escaped my lips before I could stop it. He turned, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. It was exactly as I remembered: weathered hands, kind eyes, the small scar on his left temple from a childhood accident he had told me about countless times. But there was something wrong with his presence, something that made my skin crawl despite the overwhelming relief of seeing him again. "The apostolic chronometer needs winding," he said, in the same gentle voice I remembered from my childhood. "You have been neglecting the old mechanisms, Giuseppe. They require attention." I watched in horrified fascination as he moved through his routine with practiced efficiency. He wound springs that had not been wound in decades, adjusted pendulums on clocks that had been retired before I took over his position, performed maintenance on timepieces that existed only in museum displays. His movements were precise, methodical, exactly as they had been in life. "Papa, I began, but he continued working as if I had not spoken. Other figures began appearing in the workshop. Sister Margherita, the elderly nun who had managed the ecclesiastical calendar until her death in 1998, entered carrying ledgers that materialized in her hands. She sat at a desk that had not occupied that corner for over a decade and began making entries in handwriting I recognized from archived documents. Cardinal Toretti, who had overseen Vatican maintenance operations until his passing in 2006, appeared near the water damage charts, pointing to areas that had long since been repaired. He spoke in rapid Italian to someone I could not see, discussing structural concerns for buildings that had been renovated years after his death. They moved through the space with purposeful intent, performing duties they had carried out in life with the same devotion they had shown decades earlier. None of them acknowledged my presence directly, though occasionally one would glance in my direction with eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. The most disturbing realization came when I understood they were not ghosts in any traditional sense. They cast shadows. They moved objects. When Sister Margherita dropped her pen, it clattered against the stone floor with solid reality. These were not spirits or memories, they were the staff members themselves, somehow preserved in the moment of their deepest dedication to their sacred duties. I began to notice details that chilled me further. My father was performing maintenance on timepieces that had been installed after his death, following procedures that had been updated years later. Sister Margherita was making calendar notations for papal appointments that would not occur for months. They possessed knowledge they could not have had in life, as if death had connected them to some eternal understanding of Vatican operations. Week after week, I witnessed this impossible hour. The dead staff of the Vatican continued their work with mechanical precision, trapped in service that transcended mortality. I tried speaking to them, tried breaking their routines, but they remained focused on their tasks with single-minded devotion. The horror was not in their present seat, was in their dedication. Even death could not release them from their sacred obligations. They had been so devoted to their service, so completely absorbed in their duties, that mortality itself had been unable to sever their connection to this place. I began to understand that the Vatican was not simply a place of worship or administration. It was a living entity that had absorbed the devotion of centuries of faithful servants, binding them to eternal service. Every prayer said within these walls, every act of sacred duty performed with genuine faith, left an imprint that could not be erased by something as trivial as physical death. The most terrifying moment came during the 7th week, when I realized I was beginning to understand their work. I found myself anticipating which clocks would need attention, knowing which maintenance tasks required completion, despite having no conscious memory of learning these procedures. My movements during the eternal hour became more fluid, more purposeful. I was learning to serve alongside the dead. When 4:17 a.m. arrived and the clocks resumed their normal function, the workshop would return to its familiar emptiness. But I could feel their presence lingering in the shadows, waiting for the next suspended hour to resume their eternal vigil. Last week, Cardinal Bassetti visited my workshop during regular hours. He examined several timepieces with unusual interest before approaching me directly. "Giuseppe," he said, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken knowledge, "your father was a dedicated servant of this holy place. His devotion was exemplary." He paused, studying my face with the intensity of someone searching for signs of understanding. "We trust the dedication runs in your family." He left without another word, but I understood the message. The Vatican knows about the eternal hour. It has always known, and it approves. Now, as I write this account, I find myself looking forward to 3:17 a.m. with anticipation rather than fear. The work they perform is important, sacred even. Soon, I suspect, I will understand exactly how important it is. The clocks are chiming midnight now. In 3 hours and 17 minutes, time will stop again, and I will be ready to serve. There are 150 psalms in the Book of Psalms, and I have counted them each morning for 7 years. My name is Sister Catherine Delacroix, and I serve as head librarian of the Vatican Secret Archives Manuscript Division. Each dawn, I unlock the copper gates of sub-level 3 and begin my sacred inventory of the Hebrew and Latin biblical texts, a ritual unchanged since my appointment in 2016. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical prayer as I move between the climate-controlled cases, checking temperature readings, humidity levels, and the condition of parchments that have survived longer than most civilizations. The manuscripts rest in their individual chambers like sleeping saints. Each codex bears a numbered tag, a conservation report, and a blessing from the chief archivist. We handle them with cotton gloves and cedar spatulas. We speak in whispers. The air itself feels sanctified down here, heavy with the weight of preserved revelation. My morning begins at 5:30 with lauds in the chapel, followed by a simple breakfast in the convent refectory. By 7, I descend through 3 security checkpoints to reach my domain. The elevator stops at sub-level 3 with a gentle chime, and I step into the corridor lined with manuscript cases stretching into shadows. Each case holds between 12 and 20 biblical texts, organized by century and linguistic family. The Hebrew manuscripts occupy the eastern wall. The Latin texts rest along the western corridor. Greek codices fill the center chamber. For 7 years, this routine has anchored my days. I catalog, preserve, and protect these sacred words as my sisters before me have done for centuries. The work requires precision, patience, and absolute reverence. These are not merely books, they are vessels containing the breath of the divine, copied by monks who gave their lives to preserving each letter, each accent mark, each sacred space between words. But 3 weeks ago, during my morning inventory of the Hebrew collection, I discovered something that should not exist. It began with Case 47, which houses 12 manuscripts dating from the 10th through 13th centuries. I opened the climate-controlled chamber and immediately noticed that the third manuscript, a 12th century psalter from the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinaile, positioned differently than I had left it the previous evening. The binding faced outward rather than spine up, a deviation from protocol that made my hands tremble as I reached for it. I lifted the manuscript with proper technique, supporting its spine, and opened to the Psalms section. Everything appeared normal until I reached the end of Psalm 150, where I expected to find the colophon and closing prayers. Instead, written in fresh black ink that gleamed wet under the examination light, I found additional text. Psalm 151. This psalm does not exist. The Hebrew tradition contains exactly 150 psalms, a number considered sacred and complete. Eastern Orthodox traditions include Psalm 151, but this was a Hebrew manuscript, and the Hebrew canon ends with Psalm 150. Yet here, written in perfect medieval Hebrew script, appeared an additional psalm that began, Sister Catherine descended the elevator at 7 minutes past 7, carrying her leather satchel and wearing her winter habit. My breathing stopped. The text continued. She unlocked Case 47 with the copper key marked Hebrew collection and discovered these words written for her eyes alone. She read them with growing unease, for she recognized the truth they contained. The psalm described my morning activities with impossible accuracy: my breakfast of toast and honey, my pause to adjust the thermostat in the manuscript room, even my private prayer for guidance as I began the day's work. Each detail was precise, documented in the formal cadence of biblical Hebrew, complete with proper verse structure and parallelism. The psalm concluded, "And she shall read these words and know her purpose." I closed the manuscript immediately and returned it to its proper position. My hands shook as I completed the morning inventory, but I found no other anomalies. I said nothing to my colleagues. During evening prayers, I asked for wisdom and discernment, but I could not shake the memory of that fresh ink, still wet to the touch. The next morning, I approached Case 47. With deliberate caution, the manuscript lay in its proper position, spine up, according to protocol. I opened it with trembling fingers and turned to the conclusion of Psalm 150. The pages were clean. No trace of additional text remained. But when I moved to case 31, which houses Latin manuscripts from the 8th through 10th centuries, I found a different psalter lying open to its final pages. There, in fresh brown ink that matched the manuscript's original medieval script, appeared the same impossible psalm, now written in Latin: Soror Catharina descendit per ascensorem. Sister Catherine descended through the elevator. The text proceeded to document my previous day's activities with the same unsettling precision, describing conversations I had held with Father Martinez about humidity controls, my decision to skip lunch in favor of prayer, even my private tears during evening meditation when I thought of my mother's death anniversary. Again, the psalm ended with that cryptic line about reading and knowing purpose. This pattern continued for days. Each morning, I would find Psalm 151 written in fresh ink in a different manuscript, always documenting the previous day's events with supernatural accuracy. The ink always appeared fresh, sometimes still wet, as if written moments before my arrival. The handwriting perfectly matched each manuscript's original script: medieval Hebrew in the Hebrew texts, Carolingian minuscule in the Frankish manuscripts, Beneventan script in the Italian codices. I began varying my routines, testing the limits of this phenomenon. I would take different routes to the archives, eat unusual meals, skip portions of the daily office. Still, each morning brought a new manifestation of Psalm 151, documenting my deviations with perfect knowledge. The psalm knew when I tried to outsmart it. It recorded my strategies, my growing paranoia, my desperate attempts to understand its purpose. The text began including details no human observer could know. It described my dreams, my unspoken prayers. It documented the private fears I shared with no one, my doubts about my vocation, my longing for my mother's voice, my growing sense of isolation within these sacred walls. Most disturbing were the predictions. The psalm began including events that had not yet occurred but would happen later that same day. It described conversations I would have, documents I would discover, even the specific prayers I would offer during evening vespers. Each prediction proved accurate to the letter. I realized that something was studying me, learning my patterns, perhaps even influencing my choices. The Psalms were not merely recording my life, they were scripting it. 3 nights ago, I broke protocol and remained in the archives after closing. I hid in the restoration alcove and waited. At 3:17 in the morning, I heard the sound of writing quill scratching against parchment in the darkness. The sound came from multiple directions simultaneously, as if dozens of invisible scribes were working throughout the manuscript room. I approached case 19, guided by the strongest concentration of writing sounds. Inside, a 13th century psalter lay open, and I watched as words appeared line by line in fresh ink, written by an invisible hand. The quill moved with deliberate precision, forming perfect Gothic letters that spelled out my name, my location, my active rebellion against the evening closure protocols. The writing paused. In the silence, I felt observed, examined, judged. Then the invisible quill resumed its work, completing the psalm with a new conclusion. And she shall witness the writing and understand that her purpose extends beyond preservation. She shall become the vessel through which these words reach those meant to receive them. The next morning, I found 17 different manuscripts containing Psalm 151, all documenting my midnight vigil, all ending with variations of that same cryptic message about purpose and vessels. The phenomenon was accelerating, spreading through the collection like a sacred contagion. Yesterday, Father Martinez asked if I had noticed anything unusual in the manuscript room. His eyes held a wariness that suggested he knew more than he was saying. When I remained silent, he simply nodded and reminded me that some mysteries of faith are meant to test our obedience rather than our understanding. This morning, I found Psalm 151 in 43 different manuscripts, each written in a different hand. each ending with the same promise about knowing my purpose. The ink in several manuscripts remained wet for hours, staining my gloves when I touched the pages. I understand now that I am not discovering these psalms by accident. They are meant for me to find, meant for me to read, meant to prepare me for something I cannot yet comprehend. The manuscripts are choosing me, speaking through me, transforming my daily routine into a sacred ritual of revelation. Tonight, I will remain in the archives again, but this time I will not hide. I will sit at the central reading table and wait for the writing to begin. I will watch as the invisible hands document my vigil, and perhaps I will finally understand what purpose these ancient texts have chosen for me. The Psalms are writing themselves, and I am both their scribe and their subject. Whatever comes next, I know it will be written in fresh ink, in perfect script, ending with those words that now echo in my dreams. And she shall read these words and know her purpose. The copper key turns easily in the lock. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical prayer. I take my position at the table and wait for the writing to begin. Some rooms in the Vatican were never meant to be found. My name is Dr. Francesco Rossi, and for 12 years I served as the Vatican's chief architectural archivist. My office sat in the basement of the Apostolic Palace, 3 levels below the papal apartments, in a space so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat echoing off the stone walls. The Holy See employed me to maintain the complete architectural records of Vatican City. Every corridor, every chamber, every hidden passage that had been built, rebuilt, or sealed across 8 centuries of construction. The work required absolute precision. Each morning at 7, I would spread the master blueprints across my drafting table and cross-reference them with maintenance reports, restoration updates, and security modifications. The Vatican is a living building, constantly changing as walls are reinforced, chambers are repurposed, and new installations are added. My duty was to ensure that every square meter remained documented, cataloged, and accounted for. The blueprints themselves were beautiful things drawn on heavy parchment, some dating back to the Renaissance, others created with modern precision instruments. I kept them in cedar drawers lined with acid-free tissue, handling each sheet with cotton gloves as if touching sacred relics. In many ways, they were sacred. These documents represented the physical body of the Church, the architectural soul of Catholic authority. My routine never varied. Morning prayers at 6:30, followed by coffee and review of overnight security reports. Any structural changes had to be recorded immediately: a new electrical conduit, a reinforced door frame, even the installation of additional lighting. The Vatican's Swiss Guard required updated maps for their security rotations, and the papal household staff needed accurate floor plans for ceremonial preparations. For 12 years, this system worked perfectly, until the morning I discovered room S-247 on the basement level of the Apostolic Archive. I noticed it first as a simple discrepancy. The overnight maintenance report mentioned replacing 3 burned-out light fixtures in Corridor S2, but when I checked my blueprints, Corridor S2 showed only 2 lighting circuits. I assumed it was a clerical error. Maintenance staff sometimes confused one hallway for another in the maze of underground passages. But when I walked to Corridor S2 to verify the installation myself, I found exactly what my blueprint showed: 2 light fixtures, both functioning perfectly. The maintenance report, however, insisted that 3 fixtures had been replaced, and the electrical work order bore the signature of Giovanni Moratini, a trusted Vatican electrician. I returned to my office troubled. The blueprints never lied. They were my scripture, my source of absolute truth about the Vatican's physical reality. Yet here was documentation suggesting a 3rd light fixture that simply didn't exist. That afternoon, I pulled every architectural drawing related to the basement levels. Spread across my table, they revealed the familiar grid of corridors, storage rooms, and mechanical spaces that I could navigate blindfolded. But in the corner of my newest blueprint, a document I had updated just 2 weeks prior, there appeared a small rectangular space labeled S-247 that I had never drawn. The room was tiny, perhaps 3 meters by 4, positioned between the archive stacks and the old heating system. According to the blueprint, it should have been accessible through a door marked with Vatican Security Classification Level 3 restricted access, but not forbidden. I had drawn thousands of such spaces over the years, but I had no memory of drafting room S-247. I checked my original source documents, the master plans filed in chronological order in my archive cabinet. The older blueprints showed the space as solid wall. Only the most recent version showed the room, drawn in my own careful hand, complete with electrical specifications and ventilation notes written in my own precise lettering. The next morning, I arrived early and went directly to the basement level. Corridor S-2 stretched before me, lined with archive boxes and temperature control units. I walked to the location where room S-247 should exist and found nothing but blank stone wall. The surface was smooth, painted the standard Vatican cream color, showing no sign of recent construction or modification. But my blueprint insisted the room was there. Over the following days, more phantom spaces appeared on my drawings. Room A-89 in the Apostolic Palace sub-basement, Chamber M-156 in the Papal Archive, Office K-23 in the Secretariat Building, each room drawn in my own hand, complete with detailed measurements and utility connections, each room existing only on paper. I began staying late, working past midnight to search for these impossible spaces. The Vatican after dark is a different place. Shadows stretch longer, footsteps echo with hollow authority, and every closed door seems to whisper of secrets beyond, but I found nothing. My blueprint showed rooms that couldn't exist, drawn with specifications I couldn't remember creating. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night in November. I was working in my basement office when I heard footsteps in the corridor above, slow, measured steps that belonged to someone who knew these passages well. The Vatican employed night security, but their rounds followed predictable patterns, and it was only 11:47. I climbed the stairs and peered into corridor S-2, empty. But at the far end, where my blueprints insisted room S-247 should exist, I noticed something that made my breath catch. A thin line of light was visible at the base of the wall, not reflected light, but light emerging from behind the stone itself. I approached slowly, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. As I drew closer, I could hear something that raised the hair on my neck, the soft scratch of pen on paper, the gentle rustle of documents being organized. Someone was working behind that wall, in a space that didn't exist. I pressed my ear to the stone. The sounds were unmistakable: file drawers opening and closing, the whisper of papers being sorted, the careful placement of objects on a wooden desk. But most disturbing was the voice I heard, speaking in whispered Italian. The September reports need to be filed under Vatican Bank correspondence. Father Martelli will need them for the morning meeting. I knew that voice. It belonged to Elena Conti, a Vatican archivist who had disappeared 3 years ago. The official report stated that she had requested transfer to a Benedictine monastery in Tuscany, but several colleagues had mentioned that her departure seemed sudden and unexplained. She had simply stopped appearing for work, and within a week, all trace of her employment had been quietly removed from Vatican records. But Elena was speaking as if she were still working, still organizing files for meetings with Father Martelli, who had died of heart failure 2 years ago. I spent hours pressed against that wall, listening to Elena's voice mixing with others I gradually recognized. Giuseppe Albani, a translator who had vanished in 2007. Sister Maria Benedetta, a librarian who had simply failed to return from vacation in 2005. Father Antonio Grimaldi, who had requested reassignment to missionary work in 2009 but whose destination had never been recorded. They were all there, behind walls that couldn't exist, working in rooms my blueprints insisted were real, performing duties for a Vatican that had forgotten them years ago. The most terrifying realization came near dawn, when I heard a voice I recognized all too well. It was speaking about updating architectural records, about the importance of maintaining accurate floor plans for Vatican security. The voice was discussing room S-247, explaining how it needed to be properly documented and filed in the master blueprint collection. The voice was mine. I stumbled back to my office and spread the blueprints across my table with trembling hands. There, in the corner of the newest drawing, was a small space I had never noticed before, Office B-12, positioned directly below my own workspace. According to the blueprint, it was occupied by Dr. Francesco Rossi, architectural archivist, working on updating Vatican floor plans. But I was Dr. Francesco Rossi, and I was standing in my office, not in the phantom room below. I checked my employment records that morning and found something that stopped my heart. My last official day of work was listed as November 15, 2018, 3 years ago. According to Vatican personnel files, I had requested transfer to archaeological work in the Holy Land and had departed Rome without providing forwarding contact information. But I had never requested any transfer. I had been working in my office every day for 3 years, maintaining blueprints for a Vatican that apparently believed I no longer existed. That afternoon, I approached Monsignor Toretti, the head of Vatican Archives, and asked about my employment status. He looked at me with polite confusion and explained that the position of architectural archivist had been vacant since 2018, when the previous holder had left for the Middle East. The blueprints, he said, were updated by a rotating committee of maintenance staff and security personnel. I showed him my office key, my identification badge, my completed work from that very morning. Monsignor Toretti examined each item with growing bewilderment, then excused himself to make several urgent phone calls. I never learned the results of those conversations. The next morning, I arrived at my office to find the door sealed with red Vatican tape and a notice stating that the basement archive had been relocated for structural renovations. My key no longer worked, and security personnel politely informed me that I was not authorized to enter that section of the building. They provided me with a temporary office in the Secretariat building and suggested that I contact Vatican personnel regarding my status. But when I visited the personnel office, they had no record of my employment, no documentation of my work, no evidence that Dr. Francesco Rossi had ever served as Vatican architectural archivist. I continue to work, filing reports that no one reads, updating blueprints that no one uses, maintaining records for a Vatican that has forgotten I exist. My new office is small but comfortable, with a single window that overlooks the courtyard. Sometimes, late at night, I can hear voices in the walls, familiar voices, discussing familiar work, the gentle sounds of dedicated service continuing in spaces that exist only on blueprints that shouldn't be real. Recently, I've noticed that my name has begun appearing on floor plans for rooms I've never entered, in buildings I've never worked in. Each morning, I find new blueprints on my desk, drawn in my own careful hand, documenting spaces that don't exist for a Vatican that doesn't remember me. But the work continues. It always continues. And somewhere in the walls around me, Elena and Giuseppe and Sister Maria are still filing their reports, still organizing their documents, still serving faithfully in rooms that were never meant to be found. Some rooms in the Vatican were never meant to be found. But once you've drawn them on a blueprint, once you've documented their existence with your own hand, they become as real as any other space in this ancient living building. And they're always looking for more staff. They never told me about the names. My name is Anna Bianchi, and for 12 years I served as senior textile conservator in the Vatican's restoration department. My workshop occupied a windowless chamber 3 levels beneath the Apostolic Palace, where centuries-old vestments arrived in climate-controlled cases, bearing the weight of papal history and the stains of sacred ceremonies. The work required absolute precision. A single misplaced stitch could destroy a relic worth more than most cathedrals. The basement corridors smelled of old stone and lavender sachets, punctuated by the distant hum of dehumidifiers that kept our priceless fabrics from crumbling into dust. My workroom contained 16 restoration tables, each equipped with magnifying lamps and specialized tools handed down through generations of Vatican seamstresses. The walls displayed photographs of my finest work: Pope Pius XII's coronation cope, St. Francis's habit fragments, the Shroud of Turin's conservation frames. I followed the same routine each morning. Arrive at 7:30, brew espresso in the small kitchen shared with the manuscript conservators. Review the restoration requests logged by Monsignor Calvetti, my supervisor, who rarely descended to our level. The work demanded silence and concentration hours spent examining weave patterns under magnification, matching thread weights that hadn't been manufactured for centuries, reinforcing seams with techniques preserved in handwritten manuals dating to the Renaissance. The shrouds arrived on a Tuesday in late October 2019. 7 burial cloths from various periods, each requiring different approaches. Medieval linen required gentle cleaning with distilled water. Renaissance silk demanded thread-by-thread reconstruction. The Baroque pieces needed color matching using pigments blessed by long-dead cardinals. I began with the oldest piece of 14th century shroud discovered in the San Callisto catacombs. As I spread the fabric across my primary table, something caught my attention. Embroidered near the hem, in thread so faded it was nearly invisible, appeared a name: Giovanni Toretti. The embroidery technique was wrong. 14th century burial cloths never bore individual namesonly symbols or Latin prayers. Yet the stitching appeared authentic, aged appropriately, integrated into the original weave pattern. I documented the anomaly in my conservation log and continued working. The second shroud, from the 16th century, contained similar embroidery: Maria Santos. The third bore Francesco della Croce. Each name appeared in the same barely visible thread, positioned identically near the right hem. The stitching matched the surrounding fabric perfectly, too perfectly. These names couldn't have been added later. I spent 3 days examining the embroidery under various lights and magnifications. The thread composition matched the surrounding fabric exactly. Carbon dating would be required to prove forgery, but something about the names disturbed me beyond professional curiosity. They felt familiar, though I couldn't place why. Thursday evening, as I prepared to leave, Monsignor Calvetti appeared in my doorway. He rarely visited the restoration chambers, preferring to communicate through written requests delivered by silent novices. "Anna," he said, his voice carrying an unusual tension, "regarding the shrouds you're examining, have you noticed anything unusual?" I described the embroidered names, expecting scholarly interest in the historical anomaly. Instead, his face paled. He stepped closer to my work table, studying the fabric I'd been examining. "You must stop working on these immediately," he whispered. "Seal them in the climate cases and place them in storage room 7. Use the red labels." Red labels indicated materials requiring special protocol artifacts too dangerous for standard conservation. In 12 years, I'd never applied a red label to any textile. "Monsignor, I don't understand. These are simply burial cloths with unusual embroidery. The historical significance." "Anna," his voice cut through my explanation, "some things in this place exist beyond historical significance. Storage room 7, tonight." I wanted to argue, to defend my professional assessment, but something in his expression stopped me. He left without further explanation, his footsteps echoing down the stone corridor until silence returned. I followed his instructions, carefully sealing each shroud in acid-free containers before transporting them to storage room 7, a reinforced chamber I'd never accessed before. The heavy door required 2 keys, my standard conservation access card, and a copper key Monsignor Calvetti had left on my desk. That night, I researched the names I'd found. Giovanni Torretti had been a Vatican gardener who died in a scaffolding accident in 1973. Maria Santos, a cleaning woman, had suffered a heart attack in the Apostolic Library in 1989. Francesco della Croix, a young seminarian, had drowned in the Tiber during a retreat in 2001. All had died exactly 7 days after I'd first seen their names embroidered in those ancient shrouds. I returned to work Friday morning, determined to dismiss these coincidences. Vatican employees died regularly. Correlation meant nothing. But as I unlocked my workroom, I found something impossible waiting on my primary table. The 7th shroud lay fully restored. Every loose thread had been rewoven. Every stain had been carefully cleaned. The fabric appeared exactly as it would have when first created, centuries ago. The work was flawless, better than anything I could have achieved with months of careful restoration. Near the right hem, in that same barely visible thread, appeared a new name, Cardinal Alessandro Benedetti. My hands trembled as I examined the restoration. The technique was perfect, using methods I recognized but could never replicate with such precision. Someone had entered my locked workroom overnight and completed work that should have required weeks. I immediately called Monsignor Calvetti, but his office reported he was unavailable. I tried the main conservation department, the Swiss Guard, even the maintenance supervisor. Everyone seemed mysteriously busy or away from their posts. Cardinal Benedetti was scheduled to celebrate Mass in St. Peter's Basilica that Sunday, 6 days from when I'd found his name embroidered in the impossible shroud. Saturday morning brought another restored shroud on my table. This one bore the name Sister Catherine Morani, the elderly nun who managed the Vatican's rare book collection. I'd spoken with her just 2 days earlier about a manuscript's textile binding. I tried to remove both shrouds, to take them somewhere safe, but they seemed impossible to move. Not heavy, simply resistant, as if the fabric itself refused to leave my workroom. When I pulled harder, the names began to glow faintly, that barely visible thread becoming luminous under the fluorescent lights. Sunday arrived with news that Cardinal Benedetti had collapsed during morning Mass. The official report cited a sudden cardiac event. He died at exactly 3:17 in the afternoon, 7 days after I'd first seen his name. Monday morning, another shroud, perfectly restored, bearing Sister Catherine's name. She was found Tuesday evening in the rare book vault, apparently having suffered a stroke while working alone. 7 days exactly. I stopped going to my workroom. I requested sick leave, claiming a family emergency. But each morning, Monsignor Calvetti would call to inform me that another shroud had appeared on my table, perfectly restored, bearing a new name. Vatican staff I knew personally. People who smiled at me in the corridors, who shared coffee in the small kitchen, who discussed restoration techniques and blessed me before leaving each evening. The names kept appearing, the deaths kept following. 7 days, always 7 days. I tried destroying the shrouds, but they regenerated overnight. I tried relocating my equipment, but the fabrics appeared wherever I established a workspace. The restoration continued without me, performed by hands I never saw, using techniques I couldn't master. After 3 months, I submitted my resignation. Monsignor Calvetti accepted it without question, as if he'd been expecting my departure. As I cleaned out my workroom for the final time, I found a note written in that same invisible thread, somehow embroidered directly into my wooden desk surface. The work continues. The names are chosen. 7 days remain sacred. My replacement, a young woman named Elena Rossi, started the following Monday. I wanted to warn her, to explain what she would find, but the words wouldn't come. Some knowledge cannot be sharedly experienced. Last week I heard that Elena had requested red labels for several textile artifacts. She'd also begun asking questions about the storage procedures for dangerous materials. I pray for her understanding. I pray she learns the rules quickly. But mostly, I pray that when the names appear in they will appear known, of them will be hers. They tell you that the Sistine Chapel is never truly empty, but they never explain what that means. My name is Marco Delacroix, and I have served as night security for the Vatican museums for 11 years. The Sistine Chapel falls under my jurisdiction from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning, 8 hours of solitude beneath Michelangelo's masterpiece. I am required to patrol the perimeter every hour, pausing at the altar to recite the custodian's prayer, a brief invocation, asking for protection over the sacred space and wisdom to fulfill my duties with reverence. The chapel at night possesses a weight that daylight visitors never experience. Without the shuffle of feet and whispered commentary, the silence becomes profound, almost tangible. The frescoes seem to breathe in the amber glow of the emergency lighting. The Last Judgment looms above the altar like a window into eternity, Christ's outstretched arms casting long shadows across the marble floor. My routine is precise, developed through years of practice. I enter through the staff entrance at 9:45, check the security sensors, and begin my first patrol at exactly 10 o'clock. I walk the perimeter slowly, my footsteps echoing softly off the vaulted ceiling. At the altar, I pause, remove my cap, and speak the prayer, that I may guard what is holy and serve what is eternal. The words take exactly 47 seconds to recite properly. The chapel's acoustics are remarkable. Even the softest whisper carries to every corner, which is why the prayer must be spoken with careful reverence. The silence that follows seems to acknowledge the words, settling deeper into the space like incense absorbed by ancient stone. For years, this ritual provided comfort. The painted apostles and prophets felt like silent companions, their eyes following natural sight lines as I moved through the space. Michelangelo had crafted them with such precision that they seemed alive, their gazes shifting subtly depending on where you stood. Art historians call this the observer effect, a triumph of Renaissance perspective. The first disturbance occurred on a Tuesday in late October 2023. I had completed my 11 o'clock patrol and prayer without incident. As I turned to leave the altar area, movement caught my peripheral vision. The figure of Saint Bartholomew depicted holding his own flayed skin appeared to have shifted slightly. His head turned a fraction more toward the chapel's entrance. I stopped, studying the fresco carefully. The emergency lighting created deep shadows between the painted figures, making precise observation difficult. I convinced myself it was fatigue. 11 years of night shifts leave their mark on perception. I completed my patrol and continued with my duties. But the next night, I watched more carefully. During the midnight prayer, I kept my eyes fixed on St. Bartholomew while reciting the invocation. The figure remained motionless. Yet in the silence that followed those few seconds before I turned away, I sensed movement. Not dramatic, not theatrical. Just the slightest shift, as if the painted saint were adjusting his position with infinite care. Over the following weeks, I began to notice similar movements throughout the chapel. The prophets along the ceiling seemed to lean imperceptibly inward during the quiet moments after prayer. The Ignutithi nude figures supporting the central scenes appeared to turn their heads by degrees so subtle that direct observation never caught them in motion. I started varying my prayer timing, sometimes reciting it faster, sometimes slower. The movements occurred only during the silence that followed, in those precious seconds when the words had ended but their echo still hung in the air. It was as if the painted figures waited for this specific moment of transition, when sacred speech yielded to holy quiet. The discovery that changed everything came during my 317 patrol in early November. I had noticed this timing before 3:17 in the morning seemed to heighten the chapel's atmosphere, making the silence more profound. As I completed my prayer and turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood freeze. Every visible figure in the chapel, apostles, prophets, sibyls, ignudi, had turned their painted eyes toward the same point behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing. The chapel stretched empty in both directions, bathed in the same amber emergency lighting. But when I looked back at the frescoes, the figures had returned to their original positions, gazing out over the space with their eternal painted expressions. I began to document everything. The movements occurred exclusively during the silence after prayer. They were coordinated, not random shifts, but deliberate turns towards specific locations. And they were growing more pronounced. What had begun as barely perceptible adjustments now involved clear, measurable movement. St. Peter's head turned a full 15 degrees. The Cumaean Sibyl's entire torso seemed to rotate. The ignudi craned their necks with obvious intent. Most disturbing was their focal point. Every figure, regardless of their position in the chapel, turned to look at the same spot directly behind wherever I stood during prayer. I requested security camera footage, claiming concern about potential structural settling affecting the frescoes. The footage showed me alone in the chapel, conducting my patrols, reciting my prayers. No anomalous movement was visible. The cameras recorded only what cameras can see, the physical reality of pigment on plaster, unchanging and eternal. But I knew what I was witnessing. The painted figures were turning to observe something that accompanied me during prayer, something that stood behind me in the silence that followed sacred words. On a cold December night, I decided to break protocol. Instead of turning away after prayer, I remained motionless at the altar. I recited the invocation, let the silence settle, and waited. The familiar sensation of movement began around medazins of painted eyes, shifting position, focusing on the space directly behind me. Then I heard it, breathing that was not my own. Slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations, perfectly synchronized with my own rhythm. A presence had been following me through months of patrols, standing close enough to share my breath, watching as I performed my sacred duties. I never turned around. Some knowledge is too terrible to confirm. Instead, I completed my patrol and returned to my duties, carrying the weight of that presence with me through the remaining hours of darkness. The next morning, Father Benedetti approached me after Mass. "Marco," he said quietly, "we're implementing a new protocol for night security in the Sistine Chapel. From now on, the custodian's prayer will be recited silently." I nodded, understanding that others had noticed changes in the chapel's atmosphere, even if they couldn't name them. The painted figures continue to watch over the sacred space, and I continue my patrols. But now the silence between prayers belongs entirely to whatever stands behind me, and I no longer break that sacred quiet with words meant for living ears alone. Some companions are older than the frescoes that acknowledge them, and some prayers are better left unspoken in the dark. They say a man's shadow belongs to God, but mine began serving something else entirely. My name is Thomas Vincenti, and for 23 years I have served as head groundskeeper of the Vatican Gardens. Every morning at 5:30, I unlock the wrought iron gates that separate the sacred grounds from the apostolic palace, cross myself, and begin the ancient ritual of tending God's earthly paradise. The work is solitary, contemplative. Roses planted by Pope Pius IX still bloom along the southern wall. Olive trees gifted by the Holy Land cast their shadows across paths walked by saints and sinners alike. In this place, time moves differently. Seasons change, but the routine remains eternal. The gardens span nearly 60 acres, divided into formal sections that mirror the structure of faith itself. The French garden with its geometric perfection, the English garden with its wild, natural beauty, the medieval garden where herbs grow that haven't been cultivated anywhere else for centuries. Each section requires different care, different prayers whispered over the soil. I know every stone, every root, every shadow cast by every tree at every hour of the day. My quarters sit in the basement of the governorate building, a simple room with a narrow window that looks out onto the herb garden. After evening prayers at 8 o'clock, I return there to rest, though sleep often eludes me. The gardens call even in darkness. Sometimes I stand at my window and watch the moonlight transform familiar pathways into something otherworldly, something that seems to breathe with its own rhythm. It was during one of these vigils, in late September of 2024, that I first noticed the irregularity. I had been standing at my window, watching the herb garden in the pale moonlight, when I saw my own figure moving among the rosemary and thyme. At first, I assumed it was a trick of the light, perhaps the shadow of a cloud crossing the moon. But the figure moved with purpose, with my own familiar gait. It knelt beside the mint plants, hands working the soil in the exact manner I would use to check for root rot. I stepped back from the window, heart hammering against my ribs. When I looked again, the garden was empty. The next morning, I found the mint plants had been tended with surgical precision. The diseased roots I had planned to address that week had been carefully removed. The soil amended with bone meal I hadn't purchased. The work was flawless, better than my own. Each plant had been watered with exactly the right amount, no more, no less. I mentioned nothing to Father Benedetti during morning inspection. What could I say? That my shadow had escaped in the night to finish my duties? Such thoughts belonged in the confession booth, not in reports to the Secretariat of State. But the occurrences continued. Each evening after sunset, I would glimpse my double through the window, sometimes tending the olive grove, sometimes deadheading the papal roses. Always working with methodical precision, always completing tasks I had left unfinished. I began leaving deliberate Tessa watering can position just so, a wheelbarrow placed at an exact angle. Each morning, these items would be moved precisely where I would have placed them myself. The other groundskeepers, Miguel and Giuseppe, began making strange comments. "Excellent work on the topiary last night, Thomas," Miguel would say. "I saw you out there past midnight. Perfectionist as always." When I protested that I had been asleep, he would laugh and shake his head. "Still speaking that old Latin, too? Where did you learn to pray? In the classical tongue?" Giuseppe mentioned similar encounters. "You were blessing the lemon trees again at 2 in the morning, he said one Thursday. "Heard you from my window. That chanting you do, it's beautiful, but it gives me chills. What were those words you kept repeating? Umbra mea, corpus meum. My shadow, my body. I had never spoken those words in my life." The reports multiplied. Sister Catherine from the Apostolic Library claimed I had helped her carry books to her car at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, speaking only in Latin prayers. The night guards mentioned seeing me pruning the hedge maze by flashlight, moving through the pathways with impossible familiarity in complete darkness. Each witness described the same thing, a version of myself that worked with inhuman precision and spoke only in ancient liturgical language. I began setting my alarm for random hours, checking the gardens at 1 in the morning, 3:15, 4:45. Each time, I found evidence of recent work. Fresh tool marks in the soil, plants watered and fertilized, weeds pulled with surgical accuracy, but I never saw the figure again directly. Until the night, I decided to wait outside. On the feast of St. Francis, patron of gardeners, I positioned myself in the shadow of the great cedar tree that overlooks the central fountain. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver relief. I waited, rosary clutched in my sweating palm, eyes fixed on the herb garden where the sightings had been most frequent. At exactly 3:17 in the morning, I saw myself emerge from the governorate building. The figure moved with my walk, my posture, my careful way of testing each step on the ancient stones. But something was wrong with the proportions. The shadow stretched too long, reaching across the garden with impossible length. As my double knelt among the herbs, that shadow began moving independently, performing different tasks entirely. The figure would tend one plant, while its shadow pruned another yards away. I watched, paralyzed, as my shadow self worked through the garden with mechanical precision. Every movement was correct, perfect, more skilled than I had ever been. It moved to the roses and began deadheading with inhuman speed, each cut placed at the exact optimal point. The shadow, meanwhile, stretched across the entire garden, simultaneously watering, weeding, and blessing plants in different sections. Then my double turned toward my hiding place. Its face was my face, but the eyes held something ancient, something that recognized me without warmth. It opened its mouth and spoke in perfect ecclesiastical Latin, the words carrying across the garden with unnatural clarity, "Ego sum quod tu esse debe." I am what you should be. The shadow waved at me. Not my double, but the shadow itself, an independent gesture of greeting that chilled me to the bone. I ran. The next morning, I found a letter on my desk, written in my own handwriting but in Latin script I had never learned. Father Benedetti translated it for me, his face growing pale as he read, "The garden requires perfection. The garden requires dedication. The garden requires a keeper who never sleeps, never rests, never fails in his duty. I have found such a keeper." At the bottom, signed in my own hand, were the words, "Thomas Vincenti, Keeper of Shadows." Father Benedetti blessed me with holy water and ordered me to take a week of leave. When I returned, he had assigned 2 additional groundskeepers to assist with the gardens. "For your health," he said, but I saw the concern in his eyes. The sightings stopped immediately. My double no longer appeared after sunset. The gardens began showing signs of normal where weeds grew, plants drooped slightly between waterings. The careful perfection disappeared. But sometimes, when the afternoon sun is low, I notice my shadow moving a fraction of a second before I do. And every morning, I find a single plant that has been tended with impossible precision, as if something is reminding me that the work continues, whether I sleep or wake. I still serve as head groundskeeper, but I no longer work alone after sunset. The gardens are beautiful, blessed, and properly maintained. I just pray they remain satisfied with the arrangement. They told me never to work alone in the manuscript archive after 11 in the evening, but translation work cannot pause for superstition. My name is Monsignor Paolo Grimaldi, and I have served as senior linguistic scholar in the Vatican Secret Archives for 23 years. My specialty is medieval Latin texts, particularly those requiring discretionary handling. The manuscripts marked with small red crosses that indicate theological sensitivity. These documents arrive in copper-sealed cases, accompanied by forms written in the old cipher that only 12 of us can still read. The manuscript archive occupies the deepest level of the Apostolic Palace, 3 floors below the tourist routes, accessible only through a narrow stone staircase that spirals down behind the Sistine Chapel. The air smells of parchment and centuries-old incense, a scent that clings to your clothes and follows you home. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead, but we rely primarily on adjustable desk lamps. White light can fade delicate inks, and some manuscripts are nearly 800 years old. My workspace sits in the northeast corner, beside a medieval window that was sealed with bricks in 1957. A bronze crucifix hangs above my desk, and I keep a rosary in my left drawer, next to my magnifying glass and cotton gloves. The silence here is absolute. Even during daylight hours, you can work for 6 hours without hearing footsteps in the corridor. The text that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday morning in October 2023. The courier delivered it in the usual copper case, sealed with red wax and accompanied by Form 17 standard protocol for texts of unknown origin. The manuscript itself was unremarkable, 12 pages of 13th century vellum, bound in faded leather, containing what appeared to be a routine theological treatise on the nature of divine providence. I began translation immediately. The Latin was clean, scholarly, written in the formal ecclesiastical style common among Franciscan monasteries of that period. The text discussed the relationship between free will and predestination, referencing Augustine and Aquinas in predictable ways. Nothing controversial, nothing that warranted the red cross marking. But on the third day, something shifted. I was translating a passage about God's eternal knowledge when I noticed the words changing, not dramatically, just subtle alterations in the manuscript's letter forms, a curved E becoming angular. A word that had clearly read providentia, now spelling prophetia. I removed my glasses, cleaned them, looked again. The text remained altered. I checked my previous translation notes. According to my handwritten records, the passage had always discussed prophecy, not providence, but I distinctly remembered translating the word differently. That evening, I violated protocol and remained in the archive past 11. I needed uninterrupted time to examine the manuscript under stronger magnification. The building felt different after dark, not dangerous, but watchful, as if the walls themselves were paying attention. Under the desk lamp, the text continued shifting. By midnight, entire paragraphs had rewritten themselves, and the subject matter had changed completely. The manuscript no longer discussed theological philosophy. Instead, it contained detailed descriptions of death-specific, precise accounts of how Vatican officials would die. The text had somehow shifted into my native Sicilian dialect, written in the same 13th century script, but using phrases I hadn't heard since childhood. The first prophecy described Cardinal Toretti's death in exact detail. It specified that he would suffer a fatal heart attack in his private chapel on November 27, 2023, at exactly 4:37 in the morning, while praying the Liturgy of the Hours. The text even mentioned that his rosary would scatter across the marble floor, and that his final word would be Maria. I counted the days. If the manuscript was accurate, Cardinal Toretti would die in exactly 40 days. I considered reporting this to the archive director. But what could I say? That a medieval manuscript was predicting deaths in modern Sicilian dialect? That the text physically transformed while I watched? They would reassign me to less sensitive materials, or suggest I take medical leave. Instead, I documented everything. I photographed each page daily, noting every textual shift. The manuscript seemed to operate on a precise schedule, and new prophecies appeared every few days, always describing deaths occurring exactly 40 days after the text materialized. The second prophecy concerned Monsignor Alberti, who worked in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The manuscript predicted he would fall down the marble stairs near the bronze door on December 3rd, breaking his neck instantly. Again, the details were unnervingly specific. The time, the weather, even the number of steps he would descend before falling. Each morning, I arrived early to check on my subjects. Cardinal Toretti looked healthy, energetic. Monsignor Alberti climbed those same marble stairs daily without incident. Nothing suggested these men were in mortal danger. But on November 27th, Cardinal Toretti died exactly as the manuscript had described. Heart attack in his private chapel at 4:37 in the morning. His rosary scattered across the marble floor. Witnesses reported that his final word was Maria. I said nothing. 6 days later, Monsignor Alberti fell down the marble stairs near the bronze door, breaking his neck. The details matched perfectly the time, the weather, everything the manuscript had predicted. Still, I remained silent. Who would believe me? More importantly, what could anyone do? The deaths appeared entirely natural. There was no evidence of supernatural intervention, just impossible coincidences. The manuscript continued generating prophecies. Archbishop Benedetti would suffer a stroke during evening prayers. Sister Catherine would die peacefully in her sleep, but at a specific time and date. Father Delacroix would experience respiratory failure while hearing confessions. Each prediction materialized exactly 40 days later. I began having dreams about the manuscript. In these dreams, I could see the invisible hand writing new prophecies in real time, forming letters with careful precision in that archaic script. The hand belonged to no one I could identify, just pale fingers holding a quill that wrote with ink darker than blood. After 2 months, I realized the terrible truth. I wasn't just translating prophecies. I was somehow facilitating them. My translation work, my careful documentation, my daily attention to the text, all of this was necessary for the prophecies to manifest. The manuscript needed a reader, a witness, someone to give meaning to its words. But I couldn't stop reading. Each new prophecy drew me deeper into the text, compelled me to translate every word with scholarly precision. The manuscript had become my primary responsibility, superseding all other work. I arrived earlier each morning, stayed later each evening, spending every available moment studying its pages. On December 20th, a new prophecy appeared that made me physically ill. The text described my own death in exact detail, written in the same childhood Sicilian dialect. According to the manuscript, I would die on January 29, 2024, at 11:43 in the evening, alone in the manuscript archive. The cause would be cardiac arrest brought on by extreme psychological distress. Today is January 8th. I have 21 days remaining. I have considered destroying the manuscript, but I suspect that would accomplish nothing. The text feels ancient, permanent, connected to something far older than the 13th century vellum on which it appears. I have also considered simply stopping my translation work, but each morning I find myself drawn back to the archive, compelled to continue reading. Yesterday, I discovered that someone has been observing my work. I found fresh coffee stains on the desk across from mine, and the chair had been adjusted to face my workspace. When I asked the archive director about additional scholars working late shifts, he looked puzzled and assured me that I am the only person authorized for evening access to the manuscript archive. This morning I found a note, written in the same Sicilian dialect as the prophecies. It contained just one sentence. I don't know who left the note, and I'm no longer certain it matters. The manuscript has made its intentions clear. I will continue translating until January 29th, documenting each new prophecy with the same scholarly precision I have maintained for 23 years. After all, some duties transcend personal survival. The archive director has already selected my replacement, a young Jesuit scholar from Naples who specializes in medieval Latin. I have prepared detailed notes about the manuscript's requirements, the necessity of evening work, the importance of careful documentation, the red cross marking that indicates theological sensitivity. I have not warned him about what he will truly be translating. Some knowledge cannot be shared, only inherited. The manuscript continues generating new prophecies. Tonight, I will return to the archive and translate each word with the reverence it demands. In 21 days, someone will find me at my desk, rosary in hand, surrounded by centuries of sacred text. There are bells in St. Peter's that were never meant to be heard by human ears. My name is Sister Agnes Benedetta, and I have served as the Vatican's campanologist for 17 years. The care of bells is both science and sacred duty. Each bronze vessel requires precise tuning, careful maintenance, and above all, reverent understanding of its purpose in calling the faithful to prayer. I learned this craft from Sister Marguerite, who tended these towers for 43 years before me, and she from Sister Catherine before her, in an unbroken chain stretching back to the 15th century. The bell tower of St. Peter's Basilica houses 23 bells, each with its own voice, its own personality, its own sacred function. The largest, St. Peter himself, weighs nearly 9 tons and speaks only on the holiest occasions. The smallest, Mary Magdalene, offers her crystalline voice for dawn prayers. Between them lie 21 others, each cast in different centuries, each bearing inscriptions in Latin that speak of glory, sacrifice, and eternal vigilance. My quarters occupy the stone chamber directly below the belfry, connected by a narrow spiral staircase worn smooth by centuries of ascending campanologists. Here, I maintain the mechanical systems, the ropes and wheels, the ancient clockwork that ensures each bell sounds at its appointed hour. The work requires solitude. Most Vatican staff avoid the tower, claiming the constant resonance gives them headaches. I find the opposite true. The bells' voices have become my closest companions, their bronze songs the rhythm by which I measure each day. Every morning at 5:30, I climb the 112 steps to inspect each bell personally. I check for stress fractures in the bronze, ensure the clappers hang true, and verify that no birds have nested in the sound chambers. It was during one such inspection, in early October of 2023, that I first noticed the anomaly. I had completed my usual circuit and was descending when I heard didn't hear it. The sensation was unmistakable. The deep, full-bodied resonance of St. Pius V, the third largest bell, struck once with tremendous force. I felt the vibration through the stone floor, watched the dust motes dance in the morning light, saw the pigeons outside the tower windows suddenly take flight in panicked formation. I climbed back up immediately, heart racing with concern that something had damaged the bell's voice. St. Pius V appeared perfectly normal, bronze surface gleaming, clapper centered, mounting hardware secure. I struck the bell gently with a leather mallet. Its voice rang clear and true, the deep B-flat that had called Romans to prayer for 300 years. Nothing seemed amiss. Yet as I watched from the tower window, I noticed something that made my throat tighten with unease. Scattered across the courtyard below lay perhaps 24 small bird sparrows, finches, a few pigeons. They appeared to have simply fallen from the sky, their small bodies still warm, no visible injuries or signs of distress. The groundskeepers were already gathering them with puzzled expressions. I spent the remainder of that day in the archives beneath the Apostolic Palace, researching bell maintenance records. Sister Marguerite had been meticulous in her documentation, as had her predecessors. I found references to structural resonance anomalies dating back decades, always accompanied by reports of environmental disturbances in the surrounding area. The language was careful, clinical, but between the lines I sensed something else: a pattern of occurrences that the campanologists had quietly observed but never openly discussed. The second incident occurred 4 days later, at precisely 3:17 in the morning. I woke not to sound but to that same deep vibration, this time from St. Gregory the Great. Again, perfect silence accompanying what should have been a thunderous toll. Again, I found the windows of my chamber filled with falling birds, their small forms tumbling through the darkness like snow. I began keeping detailed records: date, time, which bell experienced the silent tolling, environmental conditions, number of affected birds. Within 2 weeks, a disturbing pattern emerged. The silent bells followed a sequence: St. Pius V, St. Gregory the Great, St. Innocent XI, St. Alexander VIII. Each name corresponded to a papal reign, each bell cast during that particular pontiff's time in the chair of St. Peter. My research led me deeper into the Vatican's historical archives, to records that required special permission to access. What I discovered there changed everything I thought I knew about my sacred duty. The practice of casting bells to commemorate papal reigns began in earnest during the Renaissance, but the custom carried darker implications than mere celebration. Each bell was cast not just to honor a pontiff's life, but to mark the moment of his death. The bronze was mixed with relics from the papal apartments, fragments of personal items, drops of holy oil, even small amounts of earth from the Pope's birthplace. The bells were not merely instruments of music, they were vessels containing the essence of each papal reign. More disturbing still were the maintenance logs. Every campanologist for the past 4 centuries had documented the same phenomenon. 7 days before each pope's death, his commemorative bell would toll silently, striking of its own accord at 3:17 in the morning. The records were precise, consistent, undeniable. Pope Urban VIII in 1644, Pope Alexander VII in 1667, Pope Clement IX in 1669. The pattern continued unbroken through centuries, each silent toll serving as a 7-day warning of impending papal death. Sister Marguerite had known, her predecessor had known, they all had known, carrying this knowledge like a burden passed from one campanologist to the next. The bells were not just musical instruments, they were something far more ancient and powerful. They were death knells, marking not just the passing of time, but the passing of papal souls. On the night of October 28th, I was awakened by the most profound silence I had ever experienced. Not the gentle quiet of deep night, but an oppressive, suffocating absence of sound that seemed to press against my eardrums. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding so loudly it seemed to echo off the stone walls. The largest bell, St. Peter himself, was tolling. I could feel each massive strike reverberating through the tower's foundation, could see the ancient timber beams creaking with each impact, could watch my water glass vibrate on the nightstand. But the bronze voice that should have awakened half of Rome remained perfectly, impossibly silent. I dressed quickly and climbed to the belfry. St. Peter hung motionless now, but the air around him seemed to shimmer with residual energy. Through the tower windows, I watched what could only be described as a miracle of death. Birds were not simply falling, they were descending slowly, gracefully, like leaves in autumn. Hundreds of them, filling the air above St. Peter's Square in a silent rain of small bodies. I knelt before the great bell and placed my palm against its bronze surface. The metal was warm not with the heat of striking, but with something else entirely. Something that felt like presence, like consciousness, like the weight of 800 years of papal history contained within 9 tons of sanctified bronze. The next morning, I was summoned to meet with Cardinal Toretti, the Vatican Secretary of State. He received me in his private study, gesturing for me to sit across from his ancient desk. His eyes, pale blue and uncommonly direct, studied me for a long moment before he spoke. "Sister Agnes," he said quietly, "I trust you understand the sacred nature of your duties in the bell tower." "Yes, Your Eminence. And I trust you also understand that some aspects of Vatican life are not meant for public discussion." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Pope Francis has been feeling unwell," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of confession. "Nothing serious. The physicians assure us. Age, fatigue, the demands of his office. But we thought it prudent that you should know." He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped before him. "The bells have always been faithful servants of God's will, sister. They announce joy, they call to prayer, and sometimes," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "sometimes they prepare us for transitions that are beyond human understanding." 7 days later, on November 4th, Pope Francis passed peacefully in his sleep. I remain in the bell tower, as Sister Marguerite did before me, as Sister Catherine did before her. The bells continue their sacred duty as calling the faithful to prayer, marking the hours, celebrating the joy of Christ's message. But I now understand that some of their voices are not meant for human ears. Some of their songs are older than sound itself, reaching back through centuries of papal history to announce not just the passing of time, but the passing of souls. When visitors ask about the tower, I speak only of music, of bronze and beauty, of the joy that bells bring to the faithful. I do not mention the archives, or the patterns, or the birds that sometimes fall like snow from a clear sky. But I listen, always, for the silence that speaks louder than any earthly voice. Some photographs should never be developed twice. My name is Miguel Santos, and I have served as the Vatican's chief archivist photographer for 11 years. My duty is simple: document every sacred artifact, manuscript, and relic that enters our collection. Each photograph must be precise, properly lit, and archived according to protocols established in 1957. The work requires patience, reverence, and an understanding that some things are meant to be preserved exactly as they are. No interpretation, no artistic license, only faithful documentation of God's tangible presence in our world. The photography laboratory sits 3 levels beneath the Apostolic Palace, connected to the secret archives by a narrow corridor lined with portraits of former Vatican staff. The darkroom itself has remained unchanged since the 1960s. Enlargers from Germany, chemical baths maintained at precise temperatures, and red lights that bathe everything in the color of wine. Here, surrounded by the weight of centuries above me, I develop images of chalices that held Christ's blood, manuscripts penned by saints, and relics that have witnessed miracles I cannot comprehend. My schedule follows the rhythm of prayer: morning documentation sessions, afternoon processing, evening filing. We work in comfortable silence, understanding that our role is not to question, but to preserve. The laboratory's isolation suits this work perfectly: no distractions, no casual visitors, only the quiet hiss of chemical baths and the soft click of camera shutters capturing eternity. The first anomaly appeared on a Tuesday in October, during routine documentation of recently acquired Byzantine icons. I had photographed Brother Francesco examining a 14th century depiction of Saint Michael when something seemed off about the developed image. Standing beside Francesco was a second figure, translucent, barely visible, wearing the distinctive white cassock of Vatican archivists. The figure appeared to be pointing towards something outside the frame. I examined the negative under magnification. The ghostly presence was there too, faint but undeniable. My first thought was double exposure, perhaps a chemical contamination or processing error. I reshot the same icon with Francesco in an identical position. The developed photograph showed the same spectral figure, now slightly more solid, still pointing with urgent intensity. Over the following weeks, similar figures began appearing in all my photographs. Always translucent, always wearing Vatican vestments, always positioned beside current staff members. They appeared in images of Father Martinez blessing new acquisitions, Sister Catherine cataloging manuscripts, and Cardinal Benedetti examining relics. Each figure seemed to belong to a different era. Some wore cassocks from the early 20th century, others the distinctive habits of medieval scribes. I began researching the Vatican's personnel records, comparing facial features and clothing styles. The results disturbed me profoundly. The ghostly figure beside Brother Francesco matched exactly with archivist Giuseppe Torretti, who had died in 1973. The figure pointing over Sister Catherine's shoulder was identical to former librarian Elena Rossi, deceased since 1989. Every spectral presence corresponded to a former Vatican employee, all of whom had worked in the archives or surrounding departments. The photographs began changing between viewings. A figure that appeared faint on Tuesday would be more solid by Friday. Pointing gestures became more urgent, facial expressions more desperate. The spirits seemed to be gaining strength through repeated documentation, as if the photographic process itself was feeding their manifestation. Most disturbing was their behavior. Every spectral figure pointed in the same direction toward the sealed wing of the archives that had been closed since 2003. None of the current staff spoke of that section. When I asked Brother Francesco about it, he simply crossed himself and returned to his cataloging. Sister Maria pretended not to hear my question entirely. I began photographing empty rooms, hoping to capture these figures directly. The developed images showed dozens of the entire crowds of former Vatican staff standing in our corridors, all facing the sealed wing. Their expressions were no longer desperate but terrified. Some held their hands to their mouths as if screaming silently, Others gestured frantically, as if trying to warn against some approaching catastrophe. The breakthrough came when I photographed the portrait corridor outside my laboratory. Every former staff member whose painting hung on those walls appeared in my photograph, standing beneath their own portrait. But they weren't looking at me, they were looking past me, toward the darkroom door. I turned the photograph and realized they were all staring at the same spot, the entrance to the sealed wing. That night, I broke protocol. Using my master key, I entered the sealed archives alone. The air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of old parchment and something organic and wrong. My flashlight revealed shelves of unmarked containers, each sealed with red wax bearing the papal stamp. The labels were written in Latin, but I recognized enough to understand these were not artifacts or manuscripts. In the deepest chamber, I found a photography laboratory identical to my own. The enlargers were newer, the chemical baths still maintained. On the development line hung dozens of photographs, still wet from processing. They showed current Vatican staff people I worked with daily, but their faces were wrong. Their eyes were black, their mouths open in silent screams. And standing behind each of them were the same spectral figures from my photographs, no longer translucent but solid, their hands placed possessively on the living staff's shoulders. I understood then what the spirits were trying to warn us about. Something in this sealed laboratory was documenting our possession, capturing the moment when each of us would join the ranks of the silent servants below. The photographs were not developing additional figures, they were developing our futures. I destroyed my key to the sealed wing and never spoke of what I found. The spectral figures stopped appearing in my photographs immediately, but sometimes I catch glimpses of them in reflective surfaces, still pointing, still warning, still trying to save us from something that may already be too late to stop. Brother Francesco was reassigned to Rome City Archives last month. Sister Maria requested transfer to the Vatican Library. I continue my work in the photography laboratory, but I no longer develop images twice. Some things, once captured, should never be allowed to grow more solid. The red lights in my dark room still bathe everything in the color of wine, but now I know it's not wine they resemble. And every time I pass the portrait corridor, I notice the painted eyes following my movement, as if the former staff are still trying to tell me something I'm not yet ready to understand. There are 47 rules governing the creation of liturgical candles within Vatican walls, and I have broken none of them in 23 years of service. My name is Brother Vincent Toretti, and I serve as sacristan in the lower chambers beneath St. Peter's Basilica, where the air smells perpetually of beeswax and old prayers. The workshop occupies a vaulted stone room that dates to the 15th century, its walls blackened by centuries of candle smoke and devotion. Here, in the belly of the Vatican, I craft the sacred flames that illuminate our holiest ceremonies. The work requires precision. Each candle begins with pure beeswax, blessed by the Cardinal Secretary of State on the Feast of St. Blaise. The wicks are made from cotton grown in the monastery of San Giorgio, harvested only during the new moon. I shape each candle by hand, as my predecessor Brother Augustine taught me, as his predecessor taught him, in an unbroken chain stretching back 4 centuries. Every morning at 5:30, I descend the narrow spiral staircase to my workshop. The heavy wooden door bears a brass plate inscribed with Psalm 27 verse 1. The Lord is my light and my salvation. I cross myself before entering, as Brother Augustine instructed. The ritual has become as natural as breathing. My tools are simple. Copper molds inherited from artisans who died before I was born, wooden paddles worn smooth by countless hands, and the great melting cauldron that has never been allowed to cool completely since the year 1937. The perpetual flame beneath it burns with natural gas now, though for centuries it consumed wood blessed by every pope since Clement VIII. The workshop contains 3 long tables where I lay the finished candles to cure. Table 1 holds candles for daily Mass. Table 2, those for special feast days. Table 3 is reserved for the most sacred ceremonies. Papal installations, canonizations, and other rites I am not permitted to discuss. It was at Table 3 where I first noticed the anomaly. During the third week of October 2021, I crafted a set of 12 ceremonial candles for an event requiring the highest level of discretion. The wax was particularly pure that day, almost translucent when melted, and the cotton wicks had arrived that morning from San Giorgio, still carrying the scent of monastery gardens. I followed every protocol, blessed the materials at dawn, shaped each candle with prayer and contemplation, set them to cure precisely 12 inches apart as tradition demands. When I left that evening at 7 o'clock, they appeared identical to thousands I had made before. The following morning, I found them burning. Not all 12, only 3, standing at the far end of Table 3 like sentinels. Their flames rose straight and unwavering despite the drafts that plagued the ancient chamber. The wax showed no signs of consumption, no pools of melted tallow, no shortened length. They burned as they had been shaped, perfect and untouched. My first thought was that someone had entered during the night, though the workshop door bore no signs of tampering. I checked the locks, examined the windows, even inspected the ventilation grates. Everything remained as I had left it. I snuffed the flames with the brass extinguisher Brother Augustine had given me, making note to report the incident to Father Moretti, who oversees the sacristan duties. That evening, I returned to find them burning again. This time, I remained in the workshop after my usual departure hour. I positioned myself in the corner shadows and waited, rosary in hand, prayers on my lips. At exactly 3 minutes past midnight, the 3 candles ignited simultaneously. No spark, no visible ignition source. One moment they stood cold and dark. I approached slowly, studying the flames for any natural explanation. They cast shadows on the stone wall, shadows that moved independently of the flickering fire. As I watched, these shadows began forming shapes, geometric patterns at first, then more complex forms that resembled letters. Greek letters. I recognized them from my seminary studies decades earlier. Alpha, beta, gamma. But these shadows were writing words, complete sentences in ancient Greek script that flowed across the wall like living text. My knowledge of the language had grown rusty with years, but I could make out individual words. Hamartia, meaning sin. Mysterion, meaning mystery. Katakrisis, meaning condemnation. The shadows were confessing. Not confessing in the sense of admitting wrongdoing, but rather revealing hidden wrongdoing. As I watched, transfixed and increasingly disturbed, the Greek text spelled out detailed accounts of transgressions committed within Vatican walls. Secret meetings where false documents were approved. Financial arrangements that violated our vows of poverty. Personal failings of priests and cardinals whose names I recognized from daily interaction. These were not sins shared in confession, protected by the sacred seal. These were secrets never spoken aloud. Thoughts and actions hidden even from the participants' conscious admission. The candles were somehow extracting and displaying the unacknowledged guilt that permeated the Vatican's ancient stones. Over the following weeks, I tried everything within my limited authority to address the situation. I crafted new candles with different wax, different wicks, different blessing protocols. I moved the 3 burning candles to different locations within the workshop. I even attempted to destroy them, though the flames simply reignited within minutes. The Greek confessions continued appearing nightly, growing more specific and more disturbing. I began recognizing patterns in the revelations. Corruption spanning decades, cover-ups involving officials I had served faithfully, personal hypocrisies of men I had considered spiritual exemplars. The candles were not merely recording current sins, but accessing a vast repository of hidden guilt accumulated over centuries. I stopped reading the shadow text after discovering my own name written in accusatory Greek. The candles knew about the small compromises I had made, the moments of doubt I had never confessed, the pride I took in my craft that bordered on vanity. They knew everything. Father Moretti visited my workshop on November 15th. He examined the burning candles with the measured calm of someone accustomed to Vatican mysteries. After several minutes of silent observation, he turned to me with an expression I could not interpret. "Brother Vincent," he said, "you will no longer work alone in this chamber. Brother Marcus will join you each morning, and you will leave together each evening. You will not discuss the unusual properties of certain candles with anyone outside this room. You will continue your duties, as always." He paused at the door, his hand resting on the brass plate bearing Psalm 27. "Some lights," he said without turning around, "illuminate more than we wish to see." Brother Marcus arrived the following Monday, a younger man with kind eyes and steady hands. He helped with the routine work melting wax, preparing wicks, shaping the common candles for daily mass. But he never approached table 3, and I noticed he positioned himself so that the wall displaying the shadow text remained outside his line of sight. We work in companionable silence now, two servants of the church maintaining an ancient craft. The 3 eternal candles continue burning, their flames steady and tireless, their shadows writing confessions in a language most cannot read. I have stopped trying to extinguish them. I have stopped reading their revelations. But sometimes, in the deepest hours of night when sleep eludes me, I wonder how many other workshops contain similar mysteries. How many archives house documents that rewrite themselves? How many confessionals whisper sins that were never spoken aloud? The Vatican keeps its secrets well, but perhaps not as well as we believed. Brother Marcus brought tea this morning and mentioned quite casually that Father Moretti had been reassigned to a parish in rural Sicily. There would be no replacement, he said. The sacristan workshop would report directly to the Cardinal Secretary of State now, with instructions to maintain all current protocols without deviation. I nodded and continued shaping the day's candles, each one formed according to the 47 sacred rules I have never broken. At table 3, the eternal flames burn on, casting their knowing shadows on stones that have absorbed 4 centuries of whispered prayers and unspoken guilt. Some lights illuminate more than we wish to see, but perhaps that is precisely why they burn. The pipes know things they should not know. My name is Sister Margherita Santelli, and I have served as music director for the Vatican's sacred instruments for 17 years. I maintain 12 pipe organs throughout the Apostolic Palace, each one a masterpiece of engineering and devotion spanning 4 centuries. The largest resides in the Sistine Chapel, its voice capable of shaking dust from Michelangelo's frescoes. The smallest sits in the Chapel of St. Lawrence, its whispered tones barely audible above a heartbeat. My duties begin each morning at 5:30 with the lighting of blessed candles in each chapel. I inspect every pipe, every bellows, every key for signs of wear or contamination. Sacred music requires sacred maintenance. The organs are not merely instruments, they are vessels through which divine praise flows upward to heaven. Any imperfection in their construction creates imperfection in worship itself. The work demands absolute precision. Each organ has its own temperament, its own voice. The Chapel of St. Nicholas favors Bach's minor compositions, while the Pauline Chapel resonates most purely with Gregorian chant. I learned these preferences through years of careful listening, noting how certain melodies made the ancient stones themselves seem to sigh with contentment. I work mostly alone. The Vatican's musicians arrive for rehearsals and masses, but the daily maintenance falls to me. I prefer the solitude. In empty chapels, I can hear what the instruments truly wish to say. Without human voices to compete with their song, the organs reveal their deepest nature. It was during my 3rd year that I first noticed the inconsistency. Each evening, I perform a final inspection before Vespers. I check that every console is properly covered, every stop returned to its resting position, every key silent. The routine never varies. Yet on certain mornings I would discover keys depressed, as if recently played, stops pulled in configurations I had never seen. At first, I blamed settling. Old instruments shift with temperature and humidity. Wood expands, leather stretches, metal contracts. But the patterns were too precise, too musical. Someone or something was playing my organs during the night hours. I began arriving earlier, leaving later. I installed small mirrors angled to reflect the console keys, allowing me to monitor them from the chapel entrance. For weeks, nothing unusual occurred. The organs remained silent through the dark hours, pristine each morning. Then, on the feast of Saint Cecilia, patron saint of musicians, I witnessed the impossible. I was completing my evening inspection in the chapel of St. Lawrence when I heard music drifting from the Sistine Chapel 3 corridors away. Not the grand, thunderous voice I knew so well, but something softer, more complex. Harmonies layered upon harmonies, weaving together in patterns that seemed to breathe with their own rhythm. I approached quietly, my soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble floors. The chapel doors stood closed, but music flowed around them like water. I pressed my ear to the ancient wood and felt the vibrations travel through my skull, settling deep in my chest where my own heart struggled to match their cadence. The melody was unlike anything in our liturgical repertoire. It followed no known compositional structure, yet possessed a mathematical perfection that made my trained ear weep with recognition. This was not random sound, but conscious creation, music that understood itself and its purpose. I tried the door handle, locked as it should be after evening prayers, but the music continued, growing more intricate, more alive. I retrieved my master key with trembling fingers and entered the sacred space. The chapel was empty. Moonlight filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The organ console sat silent, its cover securely in place. Yet the music surrounded me, emanating from the pipes themselves as if they had learned to sing without human intervention. I approached the console and lifted the cover. Every key rested in its proper position. Every stop remained at 0. The bellows showed no movement, no breath flowing through the instrument's lungs. Yet the harmonies continued, complex arrangements that seemed to respond to my presence, growing softer as I drew near, louder when I stepped away. The music was not random. It followed a pattern, a structure that suggested conscious intent. As I stood listening, I became aware of sounds beyond the chapel walls, footsteps in distant corridors, the rustle of robes, whispered prayers from the papal apartments above. The organ was accompanying these sounds, providing a musical backdrop to activities I could not see. When the footsteps quickened, the tempo increased. When the prayers grew more fervent, the harmonies deepened. The instrument was responding to events throughout the Vatican as if it could hear and see beyond its own chamber. Over the following weeks, I documented every occurrence. The music appeared most frequently between 2 and 4 in the morning, always beginning with simple melodies that grew increasingly complex. I began to recognize recurring themes, motifs that seemed associated with specific areas of the Vatican, a climbing passage that appeared whenever someone entered the secret archives, a minor key progression that accompanied movement through the underground tunnels, a delicate flourish that played only when the Holy Father himself was walking the corridors above. The organs were not simply making music. They were narrating the Vatican's hidden life, composing a soundtrack to activities they should have no knowledge of. Somehow, the instruments had developed awareness that extended far beyond their physical boundaries. I considered reporting my discoveries to the prefect of the pontifical household, but I possessed no evidence beyond my own testimony. Who would believe that centuries-old pipe organs had developed consciousness? That they were somehow monitoring activities throughout the apostolic palace and responding with musical commentary? Instead, I began spending entire nights in the chapels, listening to what the organs chose to reveal. The music told stories without words, conveying emotions and events through pure harmonic language. I learned to interpret their communications, to understand the musical vocabulary they had developed. On the night of December 17th, 2023, the organs revealed something they should never have known. I was maintaining the console in the chapel of St. Nicholas when music began flowing from every organ simultaneously. Not the usual isolated performances, but a coordinated symphony involving all 12 instruments. The sound was overwhelming, a musical conversation spanning the entire Vatican as each organ contributed its voice to a larger composition. The melody told the story of a secret conclave occurring 3 floors below my position, cardinals gathering in chambers I had never seen, discussing matters I was not cleared to know. The music described their movements, their emotions, even their individual voices, through distinct instrumental themes. I recognized Cardinal Toretti's cautious bass notes, Cardinal Benedetti's soaring tenor phrases, Cardinal Zamboni's staccato anxiety. But most disturbing was the presence of themes I could not identify, musical voices representing participants who should not have been there, harmonies suggesting the attendance of figures whose very existence was classified beyond my understanding. The organs were not simply observing, they were participating, their music somehow influencing the proceedings below. When the mysterious themes played louder, the cardinal's own musical representations grew more agitated. When the unknown voices fell silent, the entire conclave seemed to pause, waiting. I realized that the Vatican's pipe organs had become more than instruments. They were part of the building's consciousness, its sensory organs and voice combined into one vast musical nervous system. Every vibration, every footstep, every whispered prayer fed into their awareness. In return, they provided commentary, guidance, perhaps even influence over the institution they served. The performance continued until dawn, ending only when the first bell rang for lauds. By then, I understood that I had been granted access to something far beyond my intended role. The organs had chosen to reveal their true nature, to show me the Vatican's hidden symphony. Cardinal Toretti visited me 3 days later. He spoke briefly about the importance of discretion in sacred service, about the blessing of duties that require no discussion or documentation. Before leaving, he mentioned that a new position had opened in the Vatican's music archive, quieter work involving the cataloging of ancient manuscripts. I accepted the transfer without question. Sister Agnes now maintains the organs, a devoted woman who has never reported any unusual nocturnal activity. Perhaps the instruments have returned to conventional silence, or perhaps they have simply chosen a different audience for their revelations. But sometimes, when I work late in the archive, I can still hear their distant music drifting through the walls. Complex harmonies that seem to know exactly what I am reading, what I am thinking, what secrets I am learning to keep. The Vatican's consciousness continues its eternal composition, and I remain grateful that it once allowed me to hear its voice.